Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a sound that every hiver knows. It lives in the walls, in the floor plates, in the very marrow of the structure that holds their world together. It is the hum, a low, persistent vibration that travels through kilometers of rockcrete and adamantium, through tangled nests of power conduits and coolant pipes, through the bones of a million sleeping bodies stacked in hab blocks that stretch so high above and so deep below that the people living in them have never once seen a horizon. The hum is the heartbeat of the hive. It is the sound of fusion plasma generators cycling deep in the thermal core. It is the rattle of conveyor belts in manufactorums that have not ceased production since before your great-grandmother's great-grandmother drew her first recycled breath. And it is the distant thunder of cargo lifts hauling raw materials from the processing docks far below to the fabrication halls far above. A vertical supply chain measured not in city blocks, but in atmospheric strata. For most hivers, the hum is nothing. It is background noise, as invisible and unremarkable as the stale air they breathe, or the grey light of the lumen strips that serve as their only sun. They do not hear it any more than you hear the blood moving through your veins. But there will come a day when the hum changes, and on that day, everything changes with it. This is a story about that day, or rather, it is many stories about many days, because across the vast and terrible breadth of the Imperium of man, hive cities are invaded with a regularity that would be staggering if anyone were keeping a comprehensive count. The administratum tries, of course, somewhere in the bowels of holy terror, in scriptoriums so vast that their far walls vanish into a haze of dust and incense smoke. Countless thousands of scribes and servitors labor to record every engagement, every siege, every planetary assault that touches one of humanity's countless urban mountains. But the galaxy is very large, and the wars are very many, and the scribes are always behind. Worlds fall and are reclaimed, and fall again between the scratching of one quill and the next. What we are going to talk about today is what that experience is actually like. Not from the macro-strategic perspective of a Lord General studying hololithic campaign maps aboard an orbiting command vessel. Not from the superhuman vantage point of an Adeptus Astartes warrior dropping from the sky in a ceramite shell. Well, we are going to talk about what happens when you are a person, just a person, living your small and unremarkable life inside a mountain of metal and stone, and the mountain starts to bleed. Because hive cities are, when you strip away all the Gothic ornamentation and the skull-faced architecture and the 10,000-year patina of religious mania, just cities. They are places where people live and work, and raise children, and argue with their neighbors about noise complaints, and stand in queues for ration dispensaries, and fall asleep listening to the hum. They are staggeringly, incomprehensibly enormous cities, certainly. A single hive can house populations that rival the total headcount of entire star systems. They reach so high into the atmosphere that the pressure at the lowest levels would crush an unprotected human body, and their spires reach so high into the atmosphere that the wealthiest inhabitants can actually see the sky. That strange, vast, open thing that most hivers have heard about but never truly comprehended. The structure of a hive city is, in many ways, a perfect physical metaphor for the Imperium itself. At the very top, bathed in natural light and breathing air that has been filtered and perfumed and temperature-controlled to a degree that would make a pre-imperial luxury resort seem Spartan by comparison, live the nobles, the spire families. These are the planetary aristocracy, the great houses whose names have been carved into the hive's architecture for so many generations that some of them genuinely believe the hive was built for them rather than the other way around. They live in estates that would be considered palatial by any standard, with vaulted ceilings and imported wood paneling and actual windows that look out over the cloud layer to the stars beyond. They drink wine that has been shipped across the void from agri-worlds thousands of light years distant. They wear clothes woven from materials that the workers in the hab blocks below could not identify, let alone afford. They play at politics with a casual viciousness that would make a hive ganger flinch, because in the spires, the weapons are quieter, but the stakes are infinitely higher. Below the spires sits the upper hive. This is where the bureaucrats live, the administrative class that keeps the machinery of governance grinding along, departmental clerks and administratum functionaries, tax collectors and census takers, the endless ranks of quill pushers and data scribes whose tireless efforts ensure that the Imperium's tithing demands are met and that the planetary governor can report satisfactory productivity figures to the sector capital. Life in the upper hive is comfortable by Imperial standards. The air is relatively clean. The lumen strips are bright enough to simulate something approaching daylight. The food is bland but sufficient, and the crime rate is kept manageable by regular patrols of enforcers and the ever-watchful presence of the Adeptus Arbites precinct houses. It is a life of routine and regulation, as of early morning shift bells and late evening curfews, of quiet devotion to the God Emperor and quiet anxiety about maintaining one's social position. Then there is the hive city proper, and this is where the numbers start to become genuinely difficult to process. This is the beating heart of the structure, the vast industrial engine that justifies the hive's existence in the eyes of the Imperium. Manufactorums the size of small nations churn out everything from lasgun power packs to tank treads to the processed food bars that feed a billion mouths. The noise here is not a hum, but a roar, a constant thundering cacophony of stamping presses and grinding gears and hissing steam valves that never stops, never pauses, never gives the workers even a moment of silence in which to contemplate the shape of their existence. The people who live in the hive city work shifts that can last anywhere from 12 to 20 hours, depending on the production quotas set by the manufactorum overseers. They sleep in hab blocks that are essentially vertical dormitories, hundreds of families stacked in rooms so small that you can touch both walls simultaneously by stretching out your arms. The corridors between these blocks are narrow and perpetually crowded, the air thick with the smell of machine oil and recycled sweat and the faint chemical tang of the nutrient paste that constitutes most meals. And below all of this, below even the grinding factories and the cramped dormitories and the tangled infrastructure that keeps the whole impossible structure functioning, there is the underhive. This is where the hive stops pretending to be civilized. The underhive is a vertical wilderness, a cascading ruin of collapsed structures and abandoned machinery and flooded tunnels that stretches down into the planet's crust like the roots of some monstrous metal tree. Power was cut to these levels generations ago, maybe centuries ago. The lumen strips are dead. The air recyclers have failed. The only light comes from bioluminescent fungi and jury-rigged generator rigs, and the occasional flicker of a las weapon discharge as one gang wars with another over territory that, to the people living above, has no value at all. The underhive is where the rejected and the forgotten and the simply unlucky end up. Mutants whose genetic deviations are too visible to be tolerated in the productive levels above. Criminals whose offenses are too serious for the enforcers, but not serious enough to attract the attention of the Arbites. Political dissidents, religious heretics, deserters from the Planetary Defense Force. People who fell through the cracks of a system that has so many cracks, it is a wonder it holds together at all. Down here, in the perpetual darkness, they build their own crude societies, form their own hierarchies, wage their own small wars. The gangs of the underhive are legendary in their ferocity and their resourcefulness, and they answer to no authority, except the authority of whoever has the biggest gun and the willingness to use it. This is the world we are talking about. A world measured not in kilometers, but in levels. A world where the concept of outside is as abstract and alien as the void between stars. And a world where billions of human beings live out their entire lives without ever knowing the color of their own sky. And it is into this world that the enemies of mankind come. They come in many forms, these enemies. Some come from beyond the stars, descending through the atmosphere in burning hulks of metal and screaming war machines. their intentions as alien and incomprehensible as their biology. Some come from the twisted realm of the warp, slithering through the cracks in reality that open wherever faith falters and despair takes root, bringing with them corruption and madness and the whispering promises of gods that should never be named. And some come from within, because the truth that the Imperium would very much like to ignore is that Hive cities are not just targets for invasion, they are incubators for it. With the same conditions that make Hive cities such productive engines of imperial industry, the crushing population density, the soul-grinding poverty, the suffocating lack of hope, also make them perfect breeding grounds for every kind of sedition and heresy that the human mind can conceive. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about what happens when the invasion begins, we need to spend some time in the Hive when things are still what passes for normal. Because to understand the horror of what comes next, you first need to understand what is being destroyed. So let us descend into the Hive together. Let us walk through its corridors and breathe its air and listen to its hum. Let us meet the people who call this place home and see the world through their eyes. What before those eyes are opened to something they were never meant to witness. Welcome to the Hive. Mind the gap between the levels. Watch your step on the grating, and whatever you do, do not look down. The alarm clocks in a Hive city do not ring. They do not need to. The shift change is announced by a sound that penetrates every wall, every floor, every sealed door in the working levels. The shift horn. It is a deep, bone-rattling blast that lasts for exactly 30 seconds, and it has been sounding at the same intervals, at the same volume, at the same pitch, for so long that the tech priests who maintain the horn systems cannot actually determine when they were first installed. The horns are simply part of the Hive, as fundamental to its operation as the thermal core or the air recyclers. And like everything else in the Hive, they never stop. When the horn sounds on a typical morning, which is a meaningless designation in a place with no sun, but the human need for diurnal rhythm persists even after 10,000 years of artificial lighting, the Hive comes alive in a way that is both impressive and deeply unsettling. Picture it. 1 billion people waking up simultaneously. 1 billion bodies rolling out of narrow cots and stepping onto cold metal floors. 1 billion voices murmuring the morning prayer to the God Emperor, the words so deeply ingrained by a lifetime of repetition that they are spoken without conscious thought, a reflex as automatic as breathing. Emperor, protect us through this day. Emperor, give us strength for our labors. Emperor, forgive us our weaknesses and accept our service. Then the hab block doors open and the corridors fill. If you have never been inside a Hive city during a shift change, there is genuinely nothing in your experience that can prepare you for it. Imagine the busiest transit station you have ever seen, then multiply it by 1,000, then stack 100 copies of it on top of each other, and you begin to approach something in the general neighborhood of the reality. The main transit corridors of a working Hive level are wide enough to drive a Lehman Russ battle tank down, and during shift change, they are packed shoulder to shoulder with workers moving in both directions, the outgoing shift heading for their hab blocks and the incoming shift heading for their manufactorums. The noise is extraordinary, not loud exactly, but dense. A solid wall of sound composed of shuffling feet and murmured conversations, and the creak of worn boots on metal grating, and the distant, ever-present thunder of the machinery that awaits them. The workers themselves are a study in uniformity. They wear the same drab coveralls, eat the same nutrient paste, breathe the same recycled air. Most of them work in the same manufactorum their parents worked in, and their parents before them, stretching back in an unbroken chain of labor that predates the founding of the Imperium itself. They do not question this. Questioning is not a survival trait in a Hive city. The workers who question, who ask why things are the way they are, and whether they might be different, tend to attract the attention of either the enforcers or the gangs, depending on which part of the Hive they do their questioning in. Though neither outcome is pleasant, but do not mistake this compliance for stupidity, and do not mistake this routine for contentment. The workers of a hive city are, by and large, extraordinarily tough human beings. They are tough because the hive demands toughness. The air they breathe is laced with industrial pollutants that would kill an unacclimatized outsider within weeks. The food they eat is nutrient-dense but chemically flavorless, the product of massive corpse starch processing plants that render biological waste, all biological waste, into a vaguely edible paste that provides the calories needed to survive another shift. The water they drink is recycled so many times that a chemical analysis would reveal trace elements from every industrial process in the hive's history. They live with diseases that have no name in the medical texts of the upper levels, immune to pathogens that mutate and evolve in the fetid warmth of the lower habs with a speed that would terrify a biologist. They survive and they endure, and they do so with a stoic resilience that is one of the most remarkable and most overlooked qualities of humanity in the 41st millennium. Life in the hive has its rhythms and its rituals, and these are important to understand because they are what the invasion will shatter. The shift cycle is the most fundamental of these, the great metronome that structures every waking moment. But there are others. The weekly distribution days, when the ration dispensaries open and the queues stretch for hundreds of meters through the corridors, and people stand for hours impatient at his shuffling lines to receive their allotment of nutrient bars and water credits. The monthly devotional services, when the Hab-block chapels fill to overflowing with workers seeking the comfort of the imperial creed, their voices raised in hymns that echo through the corridors and stairwells with a fervor that would put many a shrine world to shame. The seasonal rotation of manufacturum production, when the great machines are recalibrated and the workers are briefly reassigned, and the corridors buzz with the novel excitement of walking a slightly different route to a slightly different workplace. There are the small pleasures too, and they matter more than an outsider might think. The recaf stalls that operate in the junctions between hab blocks, where a handful of credits will buy you a cup of something hot and bitter that is not quite recaf and not quite anything else, but which provides a few minutes of warmth and chemical stimulation that can make the difference between surviving a shift and collapsing halfway through it. The gambling dens, technically illegal but tolerated by the enforcers, as long as the stakes stay small, where workers bet their ration credits on games of chance played with worn cards or carved bone dice. The storytellers, old men and women too broken by years of labor to work the manufacturums any longer, who gather listeners in the common areas of the hab blocks and spin tales of heroes and saints and the great wars fought in the emperor's name. The tales that have been passed down through so many generations of oral tradition that the historical content is probably minimal, but the emotional content is enormous. And then there are the gangs. The gangs of the Underhive are the most famous, of course, the subject of countless tales and legends that filter up through the hive's levels like smoke through a ventilation shaft. But gangs exist at every level of the hive, from the Underhive all the way up to the spires, where they simply go by different names. In the working levels, the gangs are often organized along manufactorum lines, groups of workers from the same production facility who band together for mutual protection and the advancement of shared interests. They are not, in most cases, the feral predators of popular imagination. They are more like unions with weapons, and organizations that provide their members with a degree of security and social standing in a society that offers precious little of either. Further down, in the lower hive and the upper reaches of the underhive, the gangs become more recognizable as the violent organizations that dominate the law. These are the fighters, the scavengers, the territory holders, the people who have carved out a niche in the vertical wilderness and defend it with laser gun and stub pistol and the occasional improvised explosive device. The great clan houses of Necromunda are perhaps the most well-documented examples, vast feudal organizations whose influence extends from the depths of the underhive to the lower reaches of the spires, but similar structures exist on virtually every hive world in the Imperium. These gangs control the flow of goods and services in the parts of the hive that the official authorities have either abandoned or never controlled in the first place. They collect protection money, resolve disputes, provide employment opportunities of a kind that the administratum would not approve of, and generally perform many of the functions of a parallel government, one that is often more responsive and more effective than the official one, if considerably more violent. The relationship between the gangs and the rest of the hive is complex and, from the perspective of the authorities, deeply uncomfortable. The simple truth is that the hive needs its gangs. Not the violence, perhaps, but the structures of informal governance that the gangs provide. Without them, and the parts of the hive that the official government cannot or will not administer would collapse into complete anarchy, and the resulting chaos would spread upward through the levels like a disease. The enforcers know this. The planetary governor knows this. Even the Adeptus Arbites, those grim enforcers of imperial law, know this, even if their oaths compel them to pursue and punish gang activity wherever they find it. This is the world that exists before the invasion. A world of routine and ritual, of hard work and quiet faith, of small pleasures stolen from the jaws of an existence that is, by any objective measure, brutally hard. It is a world that functions after a fashion, and held together by the hum of the machines and the habits of the people and the iron will of the Imperium, that demands their labor and their loyalty in exchange for the dubious privilege of continued existence. And it is all about to come apart. The first sign that something is wrong is almost never dramatic. It is not a fleet of warships appearing in the sky. It is not a warp rift tearing open above the spires. It is not a green tide boiling across the ash wastes toward the hive's outer walls. The first sign is something small, something that most people will not even notice, or will notice and immediately dismiss, because the human capacity for normalcy bias is one of the most powerful psychological forces in the galaxy, and it does not diminish simply because you live in a city that reaches into the stratosphere. And maybe it is a change in the hum, not a dramatic change, not a sudden silence or a discordant note, but a subtle alteration in the frequency that makes you feel uneasy without quite knowing why. You lie in your cot and listen to it, and something in your hindbrain, some ancient survival instinct that predates language and civilization, and even consciousness itself, tells you that the pattern has shifted. But you cannot articulate what has changed. And when you mention it to your habmate over the morning nutrient bar, they look at you like you have grown a second head, and you decide you were probably imagining it. Maybe it is the rats. Every hive city has its vermin population, creatures that have adapted to the artificial environment with the same tenacity and resourcefulness as their human counterparts. Rats, in particular, thrive in the spaces between walls and beneath floors, feeding on the biological waste that even the most efficient recycling systems cannot entirely eliminate. Hivers develop an unconscious familiarity with the behavior of their local rat population, the patterns of their movement, the sounds of their activity in the walls at night, the way they cluster around the warm spots near the power conduits in the colder months. When the rats start behaving differently, when they start moving in unfamiliar patterns or congregating in unusual numbers, or, most ominously, when they start disappearing entirely, the experienced hiver takes notice. Rats have survival instincts that are in many ways more acute than our own. They sense things coming before we do. When the rats run, the wise follow. Maybe it is the vox chatter. In the working levels, as the voxnet is the primary source of information and entertainment, a constant stream of administratum announcements and devotional programming and approved musical broadcasts that forms the audio backdrop of daily life. When the vox starts to glitch, when the familiar voices of the announcers are interrupted by bursts of static or momentary silences, or worse, by fragments of something else, something that sounds like voices speaking in a language that does not exist, the hivers shift uncomfortably and tell themselves that the vox relay is malfunctioning again and that the tech adepts will fix it soon. They are usually wrong. Or maybe the first sign is something more personal. A co-worker who stops coming to shifts, their hab found empty, their belongings undisturbed, as if they simply evaporated between one moment and the next. At a section of the hive that is suddenly cordoned off by enforcers, who will not explain why, their faces masked and their weapons drawn, redirecting the foot traffic through alternative corridors that add 30 minutes to the morning commute. A sermon at the weekly devotional that is subtly different from the usual script. The preacher's eyes a little too bright, their voice a little too fervent, their words touching on themes that feel dangerous, even if you cannot quite explain why. These are the quiet precursors, the tremors before the earthquake. They accumulate over days, sometimes weeks, sometimes longer. Each one individually is easily explained away. A hive city is an enormously complex organism, and small malfunctions and strange occurrences are simply part of daily life. The hum changes because the generators are cycling differently. The rats moved because of a new chemical leak on a lower level. The Vox glitches are atmospheric interference from the ash storms outside. The missing co-worker probably transferred to another manufactorum without telling anyone. The cordoned section is just a structural repair. The preacher has always been a little intense, but they accumulate. And somewhere in the collective consciousness of the hive, in that vast distributed awareness that emerges from 1 billion people sharing the same space and breathing the same air and walking the same corridors day after day, a feeling begins to grow. It is not alarm, not yet. It is more like the feeling you get when you enter a room that you know well and something has been moved, something small, almost something you cannot immediately identify. But the geometry of the space has changed in a way that your subconscious recognizes, even if your conscious mind does not. It is the feeling of wrongness, of displacement, of a pattern disrupted. The authorities, for their part, usually know more than they are telling. The planetary governor receives intelligence reports. The Adeptus Arbites monitor the Vox nets and the data streams for signs of sedition and Xenos contamination. The local detachment of the Planetary Defense Force maintains a state of readiness that is, theoretically, capable of responding to any threat short of a full-scale invasion. And depending on the nature of the coming storm, there may be other watchers as well. Inquisitors and their agents moving through the hive in disguise, following trails of evidence that the local authorities are too blind or too compromised to see. Death Watch kill teams standing by in undisclosed locations, ready to deploy at the first confirmed sign of Xenos infiltration. Astropaths straining against the pain of their psych hoods to broadcast warnings through the warp to distant fleet commands that may or may not be in a position to respond. The problem is communication, or more precisely, the catastrophic lack of it. In a hive city of 1 billion souls, information does not flow freely. It filters, slowly and unreliably, through a hierarchy of authority that is more concerned with maintaining order than with informing the populace. The planetary governor knows about the threat, but telling the workers would cause a panic that could disrupt production. And disrupted production means missed tithe quotas, and missed tithe quotas means an extremely unpleasant conversation with the administratum, which is somehow more frightening than whatever is coming from the ash wastes. So the governor sits on the information, and the Arbites sit on the information, and the PDF prepares as quietly as they can, and the workers continue their shifts and drink their recaf, and tell each other that the hum sounds a little funny today, don't you think? And then, one day, the pretense becomes unsustainable. Because the enemy does not care about your production quotas, and they do not care about your tithe schedules, and they certainly do not care about the delicate political balance that keeps the hive functioning. The enemy is coming, and they are coming now, and the first real, undeniable, as impossible to explain away sign of their arrival is something that every person in the hive experiences simultaneously. Sometimes it is a sound, not the shift horn, not the hum of the generators, not any of the familiar audio signatures that make up the hive's acoustic landscape. It is something new, something alien, something that does not belong. On Armageddon, during the Third War, the people of Hive Infernus heard the greenskins before they saw them. The war chants of the Orc horde carried across 20 miles of ash waste, and penetrated the hive's outer shell with a physical force that made the walls vibrate and the lumen strips flicker. The sound was described by survivors as something between a drumbeat and an earthquake, a rhythmic pulsing roar that grew louder and louder until it became the only sound in the world, drowning out the generators and the machines and the screaming of the people who finally understood what was coming for them. Sometimes it is a sight. On worlds targeted by tyrannid hive fleets, the first visible sign is often the darkening of the sky, visible only from the upper spires, but reported downward through the hive's information networks with a speed that official channels cannot match. The bioships of a tyrannid fleet are vast, organic vessels that blot out the sun as they descend into a planet's atmosphere, and their silhouettes are so profoundly wrong, so completely unlike anything in the human visual vocabulary, that the mind struggles to process what it is seeing. Survivors describe a feeling of primal revulsion, an instinctive horror that bypasses rational thought entirely and goes straight to the survival centers of the brain, the ancient animal parts that know, without being told, that what they are looking at wants to consume them. And sometimes, most insidiously, there is no obvious sign at all. The invasion begins not with a bang, but with a whisper, not from without, but from within. One morning the shift horn sounds and the workers rise from their cots and step into the corridors, and everything seems normal, except that the preacher at the weekly devotional has been replaced by someone new, and the new preacher's sermons contain ideas that are subtly different from the orthodox imperial creed, and the workers who attend them come away with a strange light in their eyes and a reluctance to discuss what they heard. The invasion is already underway. It began weeks ago, maybe months ago, maybe years ago, when a single organism, a single creature bearing alien genetic material, found its way into the hive's lowest levels and began a process of infiltration and reproduction that will not reach its terrible climax until the sky fills with the silhouettes of a fleet that has been called to this world by the psychic beacon of its own advance force. This is the thing that makes Hive City invasions so uniquely horrifying. It is not just that they happen, it is that they happen to 1 billion people at once, in a space from which there is nowhere to run. The hive is a sealed environment. Its walls are its strength and its prison. When the enemy comes, every inhabitant is trapped, forced to fight or hide or surrender in a structure that was designed for industry, not warfare, and whose labyrinthine complexity makes organized defense almost impossible and organized retreat completely so. Let us now examine what happens when different enemies come to the hive's door. Because the manner of the invasion shapes the manner of the defense, and the experience of the hiver under siege varies enormously depending on whether they are facing the green tide of an orc horde, the insidious corruption of chaos, or the all-consuming hunger of the great devourer. And let us begin with the loudest of them all. The greenskins are not subtle. Subtlety is a concept so alien to the orc species that attempting to explain it to a war boss would be like trying to teach mathematics to a landslide. Orcs exist for one purpose, right? And that purpose is violence, and they pursue that purpose with a single-minded enthusiasm that is, in its own terrible way, almost admirable. When an orc war host descends upon a hive world, there is no ambiguity about what is happening, no period of uncertainty, no gradual escalation, no diplomatic channels to be explored. There is simply a wall of noise and muscle and scrap metal advancing toward your city, and everything that was normal 5 minutes ago is never going to be normal again. The approach of a greenskin horde is an assault on the senses that begins long before the actual physical assault. For the inhabitants of the upper spires, who possess the dubious privilege of being able to see beyond the hive's walls, the first visible sign is usually a change in the ash wastes. On worlds like Armageddon, or where the terrain between hive cities is a flat expanse of industrial desolation, the orc advance can be seen from enormous distances. It appears first as a darkening of the horizon, a smudge of brown and green that might initially be mistaken for an approaching ash storm. But ash storms do not produce sounds that carry across 20 miles of wasteland. Ash storms do not generate clouds of exhaust smoke from 10,000 crude vehicles. And ash storms do not chant. The chanting is something that survivors remember long after the physical wounds have healed. It is the sound of millions of green-skin voices raised in unison, a guttural, rhythmic roar that builds and builds as the horde draws closer. It is not music, and it is not language, not in any sense that a human listener can pass. It is something more primal than either. It's a war cry that resonates at a frequency that activates the human fear response on a purely biological level. Combined with the ground tremor produced by millions of heavy orc feet pounding the earth in something approaching synchronization, the effect is one of approaching seismic catastrophe. The earth itself seems to be angry, and it is coming for you. During the Third War for Armageddon, the defenders of Hive in Furnace had approximately 36 hours between the first visual confirmation of the approaching orc horde and the moment the greenskins reached the outer walls. In those 36 hours, the Hive underwent a transformation that was as swift as it was brutal. The planetary authorities, who had been preparing for the invasion for weeks, but had been reluctant to share the details with the general population for fear of disrupting production, finally activated the emergency protocols. Shift horns sounded continuously, a warbling, discordant blast that was recognizably different from the standard shift change signal, and that every hiver had been trained to associate with one thing: immediate danger. The response of the population was not, contrary to what you might expect, widespread panic. Panic requires open space and visible escape routes, and a hive city has neither. What happened instead was something more controlled but no less desperate: a massive, organized migration of civilians away from the outer walls and toward the hive's interior levels. So this is one of the standard defensive protocols for a hive city under external assault. And it is drilled into the population from childhood, with the same rigor that fire escape procedures are taught in more civilized settings. The outer levels of the hive are sacrificial space, designed to be abandoned and used as a killing ground for the approaching enemy. The residential population of these levels is moved inward and downward, compressed into interior hab blocks that are already overcrowded, creating a density of human occupation that turns every corridor into a gridlocked mass of bodies and baggage and crying children and the elderly who cannot move fast enough and are simply carried along by the flow. The military response begins simultaneously. The Planetary Defense Force, whatever form it takes on that particular world, mobilizes to man the outer walls and the defensive positions that have been built into the hive's exterior architecture. On Armageddon, the PDF took the form of the Armageddon Steel Legion, arguably the most famous and certainly the most heavily mechanized planetary defense force in the Imperium. Steel Legion troopers rode to their assigned positions in Chimera armored transports, their rebreather masks clamped over their faces, their hellguns charged and ready. On other worlds, the PDF might be little more than a glorified militia, gang members in mismatched flak armor carrying autoguns and stubbers, their only training a few weeks of basic drill and a lifetime of violence in the underhive. The walls of a hive city are, in most cases, truly formidable structures. They are not walls in the conventional sense, and not simple vertical barriers, but rather the outer skin of the hive itself, layers of rockcrete and adamantium and ceramite that have been built up over millennia of construction. On a well-maintained hive, the outer wall can be dozens of meters thick, studded with gun emplacements and missile batteries and las cannon positions, its surface scarred by centuries of ash storms and industrial emissions into a rough, pitted texture that makes climbing extremely difficult.
Honestly, if I can just step back for a second here, this is one of those topics that reminds me why I fell in love with this setting in the first place. Because on paper, a hive city invasion is just a siege story. Defenders hold a wall, attackers try to break through, someone wins, someone loses. We have seen that 1,000 times, but the thing that 40k does better than any other fictional universe is make you feel the weight of it. The scale is so absurd. Billions of people crammed into one structure, entire generations who never see sunlight, and yet the stories that come out of it are so deeply personal. A ganger picking up a weapon she never trained to use, a father sending his kid through a ventilation duct with a message he knows might be the last thing he ever writes. That contrast between the incomprehensibly massive and the painfully intimate is what makes Hive City lore hit different for me. It is not just war, it is war happening in someone's living room, and that is what keeps me coming back to these stories and wanting to share them with you guys. But anyways, that was just my 2 cents. Let's get back to the video.
The gates, those massive portals through which the Hive's trade with the outside world flows, are sealed with blast doors rated to withstand direct hits from battle tank weaponry. In theory, a Hive city's outer defenses can withstand almost anything short of sustained orbital bombardment. In practice, things are more complicated. The problem with orcs is not their sophistication, it is their numbers, and their enthusiasm, and the truly disturbing fact that the green-skinned species appears to operate under a set of physical laws that are not entirely consistent with the rest of the galaxy. An orc war host of the kind that descended on Armageddon during the Third War, numbered in the hundreds of millions, possibly billions. The exact count was never established because counting orcs in battle is roughly as useful as counting individual drops of water in a flood. They came in a tide of green flesh and crude armor, their vehicles belching black smoke, their weapons howling and rattling and, in some cases, actually exploding from the sheer excitement of being fired. They hit the outer walls of the Hive cities with all the subtlety of a battering ram made of meat. And the walls, formidable as they were, began to crack. The experience of a defender on those walls during the first assault is something that is difficult to convey in words, but we shall try. Imagine standing on a parapet several hundred meters above the ground, looking out over an expanse of ash waste that stretches to the horizon. The air is thick with the chemical stink of the wasteland, and the wind carries with it a gritty dust that gets into every joint and seam of your equipment. You have been standing at your post for hours, watching the dark mass on the horizon grow larger, listening to the chanting grow louder, feeling the vibration in the wall beneath your feet grow stronger. You have checked your weapon so many times that the repetition has become a nervous tick, a meaningless ritual that you perform, not because your weapon needs checking, but because your hands need something to do. And then the mass resolves into individuals, and you see them clearly for the first time, and everything you thought you knew about the enemy proves to be entirely inadequate. An orc in person is not what the recruitment posters suggest. The recruitment posters show greenskins as vaguely humanoid brutes, ugly and threatening but fundamentally comprehensible, enemies that can be understood and therefore defeated. The reality is something else. Orcs are big. Not big like a large human, but big like a biological impossibility, like something that should not be able to exist and yet does, with a presence that is less physical than it is atmospheric. They radiate a kind of psychic weight, as an aura of violence and aggression that you can feel pressing against your chest like a physical force. Their skin is a green so saturated it almost seems to glow. Their mouths are filled with tusks that would not look out of place on an apex predator from a death world. Their eyes are red and bright and utterly, terrifyingly alive with an intelligence that is not like human intelligence, but is not less than it either, merely different, dedicated to a single purpose with a totality that no human mind can match. They are carrying weapons that defy conventional engineering, crude constructions of scrap metal and stolen technology, bolted and welded and hammered into shapes that should not work, and yet do, because orc technology operates on principles that the Adeptus Mechanicus has spent 10,000 years trying to understand and failing. As shooters and sluggers and big choppers and things that have no name in any human language, weapons that are part firearm and part melee implement and part expression of the orc aesthetic, which holds that anything worth doing is worth doing as loudly, violently, and explosively as possible. And there are millions of them. The first wave hits the outer wall like a physical blow, not a coordinated assault in the military sense, not a carefully planned operation with designated breach points and suppressive fire and flanking maneuvers. Just a wall of bodies running at full speed toward the wall, driven by an eagerness for violence that overrides any concern for personal safety. Some of them have ladders, crude constructions of welded metal that they slam against the wall with enough force to leave dents in the rockcrete, while others have grappling hooks attached to chains or ropes, or, in some cases, other orcs. Still others simply try to climb the wall with their bare hands, digging their thick fingers into the pitted surface and hauling themselves upward with a strength that is genuinely astonishing. The defenders fire into this mass with everything they have. Laser snap and hiss, their beams cutting through green flesh with the ease that last fire always brings, but without the stopping power that the situation demands. Because orcs are phenomenally tough creatures that do not always acknowledge the inconvenience of being shot. Heavy bolters chatter from fixed emplacements, their explosive rounds punching through armor and bone and the dense, fungal biology of the greenskin body. Autocannons thud, their larger caliber shells detonating among clusters of orcs with devastating effect, throwing broken bodies into the air like grotesque rag dolls. Missile launchers shriek, their warheads detonating among the vehicles at the back of the horde, turning crude trucks and battle wagons into expanding fireballs that consume their passengers with satisfying completeness. And it does not matter, because for every orc that falls, 5 more step forward. For every vehicle destroyed, 3 more come grinding through the wreckage. The horde does not thin. It does not waver. It does not even seem to notice the casualties it is taking. The dead are trampled by the living, their bodies crushed into the ash by the weight of those who come after. But the wounded fight on, with a disregard for their own injuries that borders on the comical and veers sharply into the terrifying. Greenskins with limbs missing and torsos riddled with holes continuing to advance, still roaring, still swinging their weapons, still fixated on the wall and the defenders behind it with an intensity of purpose that no human army could match. This is the orc way of war, and it is dreadfully effective against fixed positions. A hive wall is only as strong as the defender's ability to maintain fire against an enemy that does not care about casualties. And the defenders are human, with human endurance and human ammunition supplies and human nerves, and all 3 of these have limits. The lasguns overheat. The heavy bolter ammunition runs low, the defenders' hands shake, their ears ring, but their eyes burn from the smoke and the dust and the strain of tracking targets in a sea of green that fills their entire field of vision. And slowly, inevitably, the wall begins to fail. The breach, when it comes, might happen in any number of ways. Maybe the orcs finally manage to get enough ladders against the wall to overwhelm the defenders at a particular section. Maybe a mech boy, one of those orc savants who possess an intuitive understanding of technology that defies rational explanation, manages to build a bomb big enough to blow a hole through the rockcrete. Maybe a gargant, one of those towering greenskin war machines that stand as tall as a titan and are about as heavily armed, stomps its way close enough to the wall to simply push through it with brute mechanical force. However it happens, thus the result is the same. The wall is breached and the orcs pour through. What follows is the nightmare that every hiver fears, but none can truly prepare for. The outer levels of the hive, those sacrificial spaces that were supposed to serve as a killing ground, become exactly that, but not in the way the defenders planned. The orcs flood through the breach with the mindless momentum of water through a broken dam, filling corridors and transit spaces and abandoned manufactorums with a tide of green violence that sweeps away everything in its path. Defenders who were positioned to cover the breach find themselves surrounded and overwhelmed, their carefully prepared fields of fire rendered meaningless by an enemy that attacks from every direction simultaneously and does not care about its own losses. Yet the fighting in the outer levels of a breached hive city is, by any measure, some of the most brutal and close-quarters combat in the 41st millennium. The corridors that once carried the daily flow of 1,000,000 workers now funnel greenskins and defenders into killing zones where the ranges are measured in meters, not hundreds of meters, and where the distinction between ranged combat and melee evaporates entirely. Defenders fire into masses of orcs at point-blank range, their laserguns and autoguns so close that the muzzle flash singes the green skin of their targets. Orcs respond with choppers and power claws, and whatever other implements of destruction they have to hand, their massive frames filling the corridors from wall to wall, their red eyes gleaming in the flickering light of damaged lumen strips. The sound is indescribable. More, it is not the clean, sharp crack of ranged engagement on an open battlefield. It is a thick, wet, overwhelming cacophony of gunfire and screaming and the meaty impact of edged weapons on flesh, and the grinding crash of orc bodies against human barricades, and the incessant, unending roar of the greenskin battle cry that echoes through the corridors and stairwells and ventilation shafts until it seems to come from everywhere at once. It fills your head, it fills your chest, it fills the spaces between your thoughts, pushing out rational analysis and tactical assessment and replacing them with something much older and more basic, the overwhelming animal drive to survive. During the siege of Hive Hell's Reach, as the Black Templars Space Marines fought alongside the Armageddon Steel Legion and the civilian militia to hold the Hive against the Orc onslaught, Reclusiarch Grimaldus and his brothers were positioned on the northern walls, surrounded by the troops of the 273rd Armageddon Steel Legion. The Orc planetfall was violent and massive, with hulks and troop landers streaking through the atmosphere and slamming into the ground near the city. Those that flew too close to the walls were cut from the sky by the Hive's defense batteries, raining down in burning wreckage. But enough got through. The defenders had prepared for this. Every road was barricaded and manned by Steel Legion troopers. Snipers took up positions on rooftops. Battle tanks rolled through the streets. The plan was to inflict maximum casualties on the orcs in the outer sectors, and then withdraw to the next defensive line, trading worthless ground for orc blood. It was a sound strategy, but sound strategies have a tendency to dissolve in contact with the greenskin species, because the orcs do not play by the rules that human tacticians use to model their behavior. The greenskins did not stop at the outer sectors. They did not pause to consolidate their gains, or bring up reserves or establish supply lines, because orcs do not have supply lines and do not need them. They eat what they find, which in an orc's case includes almost anything organic, and some things that are not. They manufacture ammunition and weapons from whatever materials are available, yet their mech boys performing feats of improvised engineering that would be impressive if they were not being performed in the middle of a war zone by creatures that communicate primarily through violence. And so the orc advance continued, pushing deeper and deeper into the Hive, an endless green tide that the defenders could slow but could not stop. The civilians who had not been evacuated in time found themselves trapped between the advancing orcs and the interior defensive lines. Some were killed immediately, caught in the crossfire or simply overrun by the horde. Others managed to find hiding places in the Hive's complex geometry, in sealed rooms and forgotten tunnels, and the countless nooks and crannies that accumulate in a structure that has been continuously inhabited and modified for thousands of years. They hid there, in the dark. Ye would belong to a defender or a greenskin, not knowing whether the next footsteps they heard would belong to a defender or a greenskin, and understanding with perfect, terrible clarity that the world they had known, the world of shift horns and nutrient paste and the comforting hum of the machines, was gone. This is what an orc invasion does to a hive city. It does not just breach the walls and kill the defenders. It destroys the entire social fabric of the place, the routines and rituals and structures of daily life that give meaning to the existence of 1 billion people. In the space of hours, a functioning city becomes a battlefield. In the space of days, a battlefield becomes a wasteland. And the people who survive, as who manage to avoid the green tide and the crossfire and the 1,000 other ways of dying that a siege offers, emerge from their hiding places to find a world that bears no resemblance to the one they left. On Armageddon, the fighting around the Hive cities lasted for months. The Orcs did not take the Hives quickly, because even the most formidable greenskin war host has difficulty clearing a structure as large and as complex as a Hive city, especially when the defenders know the terrain infinitely better than the attackers, and are fighting for their homes and their lives with a desperation that is, in its own way, as fierce as any Orc battle rage. The fighting devolved into a grinding attritional struggle that claimed lives on both sides at a staggering rate. On the Orcs pushing forward, and the defenders pushing back in a deadly oscillation that saw individual corridors and hab blocks change hands multiple times in a single day. The civilian population, those who survived the initial assault, were drawn into this struggle whether they wanted to be or not. Scratch companies were formed, civilian militia units composed of workers and gangers, and anyone else who could hold a weapon, armed with whatever could be found or improvised. These were not soldiers in any meaningful sense. They had no training, no doctrine, no command structure beyond the most rudimentary. But they had numbers, and they had the intimate knowledge of the Hive's layout that only a lifetime of residence could provide. And they had something that even the most hardened Orc could not take from them: the absolute burning, unshakable determination to protect what was theirs. On Armageddon, during the defense of Hive Hell's Reach, suicide bombers would leap into Orc patrols and detonate themselves, destroying an entire greenskin squad for the loss of one life. Workers in the docks welded themselves into their crane cabins and used the machinery to attack greenskin war machines for as long as they could before being destroyed. The defenders fought with everything they had, using every advantage that the Hive's complex terrain offered them, and even the Orcs began to question whether the prize was worth the cost. The defense of Hell's Reach cost more than 75% of the Hive's civilian population their lives. But the Hive held, battered, broken, reduced to a fraction of its former productive capacity, but it held. And in the calculus of the 41st millennium, that counts as a victory. But not every Hive is so fortunate, and not every invasion comes from outside. If the greenskin invasion is a hammer blow, a catastrophic external force applied to the Hive's structure with overwhelming violence, then the chaos invasion is a cancer. It grows slowly, silently, in the dark places where the light of the imperial creed does not reach, and the eyes of the authorities do not look. It feeds on the same conditions that sustain the Hive itself: the desperation of the workers, the ambition of the powerful, the profound spiritual hunger of people who live and die in a metal mountain and never see the sky. Chaos cults are as old as the Imperium itself, and they thrive in Hive cities for reasons that are as practical as they are spiritual. Whereas the teeming masses of a Hive, packed into their hab blocks and their manufactorums, living out their lives in a state of grinding monotony punctuated by sudden violence, represent the perfect recruitment pool for the servants of the dark gods. The desperate want power, the oppressed want freedom, the ambitious want advancement, and the ruinous powers are nothing if not generous with their promises, even if the actual rewards they deliver tend to involve tentacles, madness, and an eternity of screaming. The formation of a chaos cult in a Hive city follows a pattern that is depressingly familiar to the agents of the Ordo Hereticus. It begins with a single individual, a charismatic figure who has been touched by the influence of the warp, and who begins to preach a message of liberation and empowerment to those around them. This preaching is done carefully, cautiously, in whispered conversations in the back corners of recaf stores, and encoded messages passed between trusted associates. The initial recruits are drawn from the ranks of the disaffected, workers who have been injured and can no longer meet their production quotas, gangers who have been pushed out of their territory, mutants who have been forced into the underhive by the intolerance of the levels above. These are people with nothing to lose, and the cult offers them something that the Imperium never has: a sense of belonging, a purpose beyond the endless cycle of labor and sleep, and the intoxicating promise of power. The cult grows in the shadows, adding members slowly, carefully, always conscious of the danger of discovery. A cult that moves too fast attracts attention. A cult that attracts attention is destroyed. And so the cultists learn patience. The patience of the spider spinning its web. The patience of the predator waiting for its prey to lower its guard. They establish themselves behind the front of legitimate organizations, trade unions, charitable societies, variants of the imperial creed that are subtly different from the orthodox version in ways that only a trained theologian would notice. They infiltrate the existing power structures of the Hive, placing their members in positions of influence within the manufactorums, the enforcers, even, in the most extreme cases, the planetary defense force. The cult is, in many ways, a mirror image of the Hive itself. Both are hierarchical structures where power flows from the top down. Both demand absolute loyalty from their members. Yet both use a combination of reward and punishment to maintain control. The difference is that the cult offers rewards that the Hive cannot. Physical enhancement through mutation, psychic power through communion with the warp, and the simple but potent reward of being part of something secret and forbidden in a society where secrecy and freedom are the rarest of commodities. The moment of revelation, when the cult finally throws off its disguise and reveals its true nature, is one of the most devastating events that can befall a Hive city. Because unlike an external invasion, which announces itself with noise and violence and gives the defenders time to prepare, a chaos uprising happens everywhere at once. Cultists, who have been living as normal hivers for years or decades, suddenly produce weapons from hidden caches. PDF soldiers, who have been secretly inducted into the cult, turn their guns on their comrades. Manufactorum workers sabotage the machinery they have tended for their entire working lives, crippling production and, in some cases, causing explosions that destroy entire levels. The cult has been threading itself through the Hive's social fabric, like a poison through a bloodstream, and when it finally acts, the entire body convulses. The experience of a loyal Hiver during a chaos uprising is qualitatively different from the experience of one under Orc assault. With the Orcs, the enemy is obvious, alien, immediately recognizable as other. There is a terrible clarity to it. They are there, you are here, and the space between you is the battlefield. With chaos, the enemy could be anyone. Your co-worker, your neighbor, your habmate. Our person you have been sharing nutrient bars. Person you have been sharing nutrient bars with for the past 5 years has been secretly worshipping entities that want to devour your soul, is a kind of horror that no external threat can match. The uprising in Hive Tertium on Atoma Prime provides a particularly instructive example. The Chaos Cult, known as the Admonition, had spent years embedding itself in the lower and middle levels of the Hive, operating through multiple cells that communicated through obscure symbols and coded messages. When the uprising began, it was not a single dramatic event, but a cascading series of crises that overwhelmed the Hive's ability to respond. A zombie plague, spawned by the cult's devotion to Nurgle, began to spread through the lower levels, turning citizens into shambling, infectious horrors. The water supply, controlled by a cartel that the cult had secretly taken over, was used to distribute the plague more widely. And the Moabian 6th Regiment, an Astra Militarum unit that had been sent to quell the uprising, revealed itself to be corrupted, turning its weapons on the very people it had been sent to protect. The result was chaos in both the literal and colloquial senses. The Hive's normal governance structures collapsed almost overnight, unable to cope with a threat that came from within their own ranks. The enforcers, those overworked and underpaid guardians of Hive order, found themselves fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, trying to contain the plague, suppress the cult, and maintain some semblance of order among a civilian population that was, quite understandably, losing its collective mind. Communications were disrupted by heretical broadcasts on the Voxnet, mind-altering transmissions that could corrupt or confuse anyone who listened for too long. The very infrastructure of the Hive, the water systems, and the power grid, and the air recyclers, became weapons in the hands of the cult turned against the population they were designed to serve. This is the insidious genius of chaos as an invading force. It does not need to breach the walls because it is already inside them. It does not need to overwhelm the defenders because the defenders are already compromised. It attacks not the body of the hive, but its soul, turning trust into suspicion, loyalty into betrayal, faith into heresy. And it does so with a patience and a sophistication that the other enemies of mankind, for all their terrible power, cannot match. The defense against a chaos uprising is, correspondingly, much more difficult to organize than the defense against an external assault. You cannot simply man the walls and fire into the approaching enemy, because the enemy is already past the walls and mixed in with the people you are trying to protect. The Inquisition, those grim guardians of humanity's spiritual purity, are the imperial institution best equipped to deal with this kind of threat, and their methods are as ruthless as they are necessary. Entire levels of a hive can be sealed off and subjected to purge operations, with inquisitorial stormtroopers and, in extreme cases, or Adeptus Astartes kill teams moving through the corridors with orders to eliminate anyone bearing the taint of corruption. The collateral damage from such operations is often enormous, measured not in broken buildings, but in broken lives, in loyal citizens who are killed alongside the heretics because there is no time and no method for distinguishing between the two in the heat of combat. For the ordinary hiver, caught between the cult and the purge, the experience is one of absolute helplessness. They cannot fight the cultists because they do not know who the cultists are. They cannot trust the authorities because the authorities might be compromised. They cannot hide because the hive's emergency protocols, designed for external threats, are worse than useless against an internal one. They can only wait and pray and hope that the emperor's servants arrive before the corruption spreads too far. But there is another form of internal invasion that is, in many ways, even more insidious than chaos. Because at least with chaos, the corruption is spiritual, and the corrupted know, on some level, what they have become. With the Genestealer cult, the corruption is biological, and the victims do not know they have been compromised until it is far, far too late. The Genestealer is the vanguard organism of the Tyrannid hive fleets, and it is perhaps the most perfectly adapted infiltrator in the galaxy. A single Genestealer arriving on a hive world hidden in the cargo hold of a merchant vessel or stowed away in the bilge of a pilgrim transport can begin a process of infiltration that will not reach its conclusion for generations. Whilst the creature does not attack openly, it does not announce itself with violence, it hides and it waits, and when opportunity presents itself, it uses its ovipositor to implant its genetic material into a human host, beginning a cycle of reproduction that will slowly, silently, invisibly transform the host's family line into something that is no longer entirely human. The first generation of Genestealer hybrids are monstrous, clearly inhuman, with additional limbs and distorted features that make them impossible to pass as normal citizens. They are hidden by their parents, who have been psychically bonded to the Genestealer patriarch and believe with absolute conviction that their offspring are blessed, not cursed. The second generation is less obviously alien, but still clearly abnormal. The third generation is almost human, and the fourth generation is indistinguishable from a normal person in all but the most detailed medical examination. It is at this point that the cult begins its true infiltration, inserting its members into every level of hive society, from the lowest gangs of the underhive to the highest offices of the planetary government. The Genestealer cult operates with a discipline and a coordination that puts even the most sophisticated chaos cult to shame, because it is not driven by ideology or faith, but by biology. Every member of the cult is psychically linked to the patriarch through a gestalt consciousness called the broodmind, a pale reflection of the Tyrannid hive mind that gives the cult a unity of purpose that no human organization can match. The cult members do not choose to serve the patriarch. They cannot choose not to. The Genestealer cult is an almost invisible threat. Its members look human. They act human. They hold down jobs and pay their tithes and attend the weekly devotional services, although the sermons they whisper to each other in private have nothing to do with the God Emperor. They recruit not through ideology but through biology, each new generation of hybrids adding to the cult's numbers with a geometric progression that is as relentless as it is undetectable. By the time the cult is large enough to be noticed, it is too large to be easily destroyed. It has members in the PDF, in the Enforcers, in the Manufactorum management hierarchy, in the planetary governor staff. Its tendrils reach everywhere, and cutting one only reveals a dozen more. On the Hive world of Ikar 4, the Genestealer cult known as the Brotherhood had infected the planet for generations before it was finally discovered. The cult's uprising, triggered by the approaching psychic call of Hive Fleet Kraken, was devastating precisely because it came from within. Defense perimeters were overrun not by alien organisms, but by the Hive's own citizens, people who had lived and worked alongside the defenders for their entire lives, and who now attacked them with a ferocity that was as unexpected as it was terrifying. The Ultramarines, led by Chapter Master Marneos Kalga, eventually cleansed the planet of both the cult and the Tyrannid forces that followed. But the cost was enormous, measured not just in lives lost, but in the fundamental breach of trust that the cult's existence represented. Because that is the real horror of the Genestealer cult. Not the alien DNA, not the psychic manipulation, not even the monstrous hybrids that lurk in the Underhive waiting for the day of ascension. The real horror is the knowledge that your world has been compromised from within, that the people you trusted were not people at all, but vessels for something alien and hungry, and that the invasion began not when the bioships appeared in the sky, but when the first Genestealer found its way into the Hive's lowest levels and began to do what it was created to do. When the day of ascension finally arrives, when the cult rises up, and the sky fills with the shadow of descending bioships, and the Hive city faces a two-front war that is almost impossible to survive. From above, the Tyrannid swarm descends, a rain of living ammunition that crashes through the Hive's upper levels with the force of an orbital bombardment. From below, the cult attacks, its members emerging from hidden tunnels and secret chambers to strike at the Hive's infrastructure with the precision that only an intimate knowledge of the target can provide. The defenders find themselves caught between these two forces, fighting enemies above and below and within, unable to trust anyone, unable to hold any position that is not immediately threatened from at least two directions. The Tyrannid swarm itself is something that deserves its own consideration, because it represents a kind of invasion that is fundamentally different from anything else in the galaxy. Orcs come to fight. Chaos comes to corrupt. The Tyrannids come to feed. Their invasion is not a military campaign in any recognizable sense. It is a biological process, as impersonal and as unstoppable as the movement of a glacier or the growth of a fungal colony. The organisms that make up a Tyrannid swarm are not individuals in any meaningful sense. They are components of a superorganism, extensions of the hive mind that controls them, and their behavior is dictated not by strategy or ideology, but by the simple, overwhelming imperative to consume biological matter and convert it into more Tyrannid organisms. When the swarm reaches a hive city, the assault begins with the vanguard organisms, Genestealers, Lictors, and other infiltration forms that have been seeded ahead of the main force. These creatures move through the hive's ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels, using the hive's own infrastructure as a highway, striking at isolated defenders and communication nodes with a precision that suggests intelligence far beyond what their animal appearance would imply. Behind them come the warrior organisms, hormagaunts and termagants in their millions, flooding through the corridors in a living tide that fills every available space. They move with a coordination that no human army could match, directed by the synapse creatures that serve as the hive mind's local relay points, these larger organisms acting as mobile command centers that keep the lesser creatures focused and effective. The experience of fighting Tyranids inside a hive city is unlike any other form of combat. There is no negotiation, no surrender, no possibility of coexistence. The Tyranids do not take prisoners. They do not occupy territory. They consume. Every corridor cleared must be held, because the swarm will flow back into any space that is left undefended, like water filling a void. Every victory is temporary, because behind the organisms you have just killed, there are thousands more pressing forward, driven by the hive mind's relentless hunger. The smell is something that survivors mention again and again in their testimonies. A thick organic stench of acidic secretions and decomposing matter that clings to everything and makes breathing a conscious, nauseating effort, even through a rebreather mask. The psychological impact on the defenders is often more devastating than the physical casualties. Humans are social creatures, and human warfare, for all its horror, retains certain social conventions that make it psychologically manageable. Even the most fanatical chaos cultist can, in theory, be reasoned with. Even the most savage orc can, in a certain crude sense, be understood. The Tyranids offer none of these comforts. They cannot be bargained with. They cannot be intimidated. They do not understand mercy or fear or any of the emotions that give human conflict its shape and its meaning. They are hunger made flesh, and they will not stop until everything is consumed. The hive cities that have faced Tyranid assaults and survived, and they are frighteningly few, bear scars that go deeper than structural damage. The survivors carry with them a knowledge that changes them fundamentally, the knowledge that there exists, in the space between the stars, a force that does not hate them, or fear them, or envy them, but simply wants to eat them, and that this force is so vast and so powerful that the entire Imperium of man, with all its armies and its faith and its 10,000-year history, is nothing more than a particularly large meal. But we should talk about the people who stand between the hive's population and these nightmares. Because the story of a hive city invasion is not just a story of enemies and victims, it is also a story of defenders, of the ordinary men and women and the extraordinary warriors who take up arms and say, "No further, not while I stand." And their story is, in many ways, the most compelling of all. There is something we have not discussed yet, and it would be a disservice to the subject to leave it unaddressed. We have talked about what happens when the enemy arrives from outside the hive, crashing through walls and flooding corridors. We have talked about what happens when the enemy grows from within, cultists and parasites gnawing at the hive's foundations. But we have not talked about the particular horror of what happens when the enemy comes from both directions at once. Because that is the nightmare scenario, the one that the defenders pray will never materialize, and the one that materializes more often than the Imperium would like to admit. Consider the experience of the defenders of Ikar IV when Hive Fleet Kraken arrived. The Genestealer cult, known as the Brotherhood, had been growing in the Hive's underbelly for generations, patiently expanding its network, inserting its members into positions of authority, and building towards the day of ascension that every cult member anticipated with a fervor that was indistinguishable from religious ecstasy. The Imperium knew that the cult existed. Inquisitor Agmar of the Ordo Xenos had been investigating the Brotherhood for some time, piecing together the evidence of alien infiltration from a mosaic of suspicious deaths, unusual birth records, and the kind of small, subtle irregularities that only a trained inquisitorial eye would notice. He was making progress. He was close to unraveling the whole operation. And then the sky darkened, and the bioships came, and everything changed. The cult rose the moment the Tyranid vanguard organisms began their descent into the atmosphere. It was not a coincidence. The timing was coordinated through the broodmind, the psychic network that connected every cult member to the Patriarch and, through the Patriarch, to the approaching hive mind. Thousands of cultists, who had been living as apparently normal Imperial citizens for their entire lives, suddenly produced weapons from hidden caches and attacked the Hive's defenders from behind. Defense perimeters that had been oriented to face the incoming Tyranid organisms were hit from the rear by people who, an hour earlier, had been standing in the same defense lines. The confusion was absolute. Soldiers did not know who to trust. Officers gave orders that were countermanded by subordinates who had been secret cult members for decades. Communications networks were compromised by cultists who had infiltrated the communications core. The defense, which had been organized on the assumption that the enemy was coming from one direction, suddenly found itself fighting on every side simultaneously. The Ultramarines eventually cleansed Ikar 4 of both the cult and the Tyranid swarm, but the planet was scarred beyond recognition. The fighting in the claustrophobic corridors of the Ikaran Hive cities lasted for close to a full standard year, a grinding, exhausting campaign of room-by-room clearance that tested even the superhuman endurance of the Adeptus Astartes. The Tyranid war veterans who had fought against Hive Fleet Behemoth on Makraga 2 centuries earlier brought their experience to bear, but even their hard-won knowledge of Tyranid tactics could not entirely compensate for the challenge of fighting an enemy that was both inside and outside the Hive simultaneously. The simultaneous internal-external invasion is devastating because it attacks the defender's most fundamental assumption, that there is a front line, a boundary between safe and unsafe, a space behind the barricade where they can rest and resupply and receive medical treatment and simply breathe for a moment without expecting a weapon to come swinging at their head. When the enemy is behind you, as well as in front of you, there is no safe space. There is no rear area. There is no rest. There is only combat in every direction, at every moment, with no way to know which threat to prioritize and no way to address one without leaving yourself vulnerable to the other. The psychological impact of this situation is almost impossible to overstate. Trust, the most basic requirement for any cooperative defense, evaporates completely. Every face becomes suspect. Every hand that reaches toward you might be reaching for a weapon. The paranoia that takes hold in a hive under simultaneous internal and external assault is a corrosive force that can destroy a defense more thoroughly than any military setback. Defenders turn on each other, seeing traitors where there are none, wasting ammunition and lives on false alarms and mistaken identities. Units that should be cooperating become hostile, each convinced that the other has been infiltrated. The command structure, already strained by the pressures of the siege, fractures under the weight of suspicion, and the fragments are too small and too distrustful to mount an effective coordinated defense. The Imperium's response to this type of threat has evolved over the millennia, though evolved is perhaps too generous a word. The protocols for dealing with simultaneous internal and external assault are brutal, pragmatic, and often as destructive as the threat they are designed to counter. The Inquisition's standing orders for a world facing a combined Genestealer cult uprising and Tyranid invasion include the option of exterminatus, the complete destruction of the planet's surface, a measure that eliminates the threat at the cost of everything and everyone that the threat was threatening. This option is rarely exercised because even the most ruthless Inquisitor recognizes that destroying the planet you are trying to save is a solution that rather misses the point. But the fact that it remains on the table tells you something about the severity of the threat and the limitations of the alternatives. Short of exterminatus, as the response typically involves the deployment of specialized inquisitorial forces, Deathwatch kill teams, and, when available, Space Marine chapters with experience fighting Tyranids. The objective is to identify and eliminate the Genestealer Patriarch, the psychic keystone of the cult, on the theory that destroying the Patriarch will sever the broodmind and cause the cult to lose its coordination and cohesion. This is sound reasoning, but executing it in the middle of a planetary invasion is another matter entirely. The Patriarch is typically located in the deepest, most heavily defended part of the Hive, surrounded by layers of devoted cultists and, in many cases, by pure-strain Genestealers, whose combat capabilities rival those of a Space Marine in close quarters. The kill team that goes after the Patriarch is on a one-way mission. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the base. The kill team fights its way into the underhive, through corridors that are full of cult members and tyrannid organisms and the debris of the fighting that has already torn the hive apart. They navigate by instinct and by faith because the maps are useless in a city that has been remodeled by both construction and destruction over thousands of years, and because the cult has booby-trapped every obvious route to the Patriarch's lair. When they finally reach their target, the fighting that follows is close, desperate, and final. The Patriarch is a creature of immense psychic power and physical strength, and it does not die easily. It does not die quietly, and the warriors who kill it rarely survive the encounter. But when the Patriarch falls, the effect on the cult is immediate and devastating. The broodmind, that psychic network that gave the cult its unity and its purpose, collapses. Cult members who were fighting with fanatical coordination suddenly become confused, disoriented, lost. Some of them, the ones in whom the human elements of their consciousness have not been completely overridden by the alien imperative, look around at what they have done, at the bodies of the people they have killed, and the buildings they have destroyed, and the world they have helped to ruin, and the horror of realization is worse than any wound. They were instruments, the tools of an alien will that used their hands and their minds and their lives as casually as a craftsman uses a chisel, and now that the will has been removed, they are left with the consequences and the guilt and the knowledge that everything they believed was a lie. These moments of clarity are, in their own way, among the most terrible in the entire catalogue of Hive city sieges. A cultist who regains their awareness in the middle of a firefight, who suddenly understands that they have been fighting for the wrong side, that the beings they worshipped as gods are in fact unthinking organisms that see them as nothing more than a source of biological raw material, faces a choice that no human should have to make. Some of them drop their weapons and surrender, and throwing themselves on the mercy of defenders who have every reason to show them none. Some of them turn their weapons on their former allies, fighting with the same ferocity that they previously directed at the defenders. as if they can somehow undo the damage they have done by fighting against it now. And some of them simply collapse. The weight of what they have been and what they have done, proving too heavy for a consciousness that was never designed to carry it. The aftermath of a combined genestealer cult and tyrannid invasion is, by any measure, the worst possible outcome for a hive city short of complete destruction. The physical damage is catastrophic, the result of fighting on every level and in every direction simultaneously. The social fabric is shredded, thus the bonds of trust and community that held the hive together severed by the revelation that the enemy was living among them all along. The survivors are haunted not just by what they experienced, but by the uncertainty of not knowing whether the infestation has been completely eradicated, whether there might still be dormant cult members waiting in the shadows, whether the nightmare might begin again at any moment. On Ikar 4, even after the fighting was officially declared over, the Imperium maintained a heightened inquisitorial presence for decades, monitoring the population for any sign of resurgent genestealer activity. The citizens of the Akaran hives lived under a level of surveillance that would have been considered oppressive even by the Imperium's generous standards, subject to random genetic screening and psychological evaluation, and the ever-present possibility that any deviation from normality, any unexplained absence, any unusual behavior, any physical symptom that could conceivably be attributed to alien contamination, might result in a visit from the Inquisition. The psychological cost of this surveillance was enormous, creating a culture of fear and suspicion that persisted long after the physical threat had been eliminated. This is the full scope of what it means for a hive city to be invaded. It is not just a military event. It is a social, economic, psychological, and spiritual catastrophe that affects every aspect of life within the hive, and that radiates outward to affect the broader Imperium in ways that are both predictable and surprising. As the military histories record the battles and the casualties and the strategic outcomes, the Administratum records the economic impact and the production losses and the tithe adjustments. The Inquisition records the nature and the extent of any corruption, xenos or otherwise, that was involved in the invasion. But no one records the full story, the story of what it was like to be there, to live through it, to survive it, and carry the scars. That story belongs to the people of the hive, the workers and the gangers and the nobles and the children and the elderly and the soldiers and the preachers and the administrators and the millions of anonymous human beings who lived and fought and died inside their metal mountain. Their story is the real story of hive city invasions, and it is a story that deserves to be told, not because it is heroic, though it often is, and not because it is tragic, though it always is, but because it is human, and in the grim darkness of the far future, humanity is the most precious and most endangered thing there is. The hive remembers, the hive endures, and somewhere, deep in the bowels of the structure, beneath the levels that have been rebuilt, and the corridors that have been cleared, and the hab blocks that have been repopulated with strangers who do not know the history of the walls around them, the old residents of the hive, the ones who were there when the world came apart, listen to the hum and remember when it stopped, and are grateful in their quiet, scarred, unbreakable way that it started again. The Emperor protects, but sometimes, and the Emperor's protection takes the form of 1 billion ordinary people who pick up weapons they barely understand and stand in corridors they will never leave and say, with their actions if not their words, "This is our home, and you cannot have it." That is the story of every hive city invasion that has ever been fought, and it is the story that makes the 41st millennium worth telling. The first line of defense for any hive city is the Planetary Defense Force, and the first thing you need to understand about the PDF is that it is not the Imperial Guard. This distinction matters, and it matters a great deal. The Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, is the Imperium's premier fighting force, millions upon millions of trained, equipped, and battle-hardened soldiers who fight across the galaxy in the Emperor's name. Oh, the PDF is what you get when the Imperial Guard is somewhere else, which is almost always fighting someone else's war on someone else's planet. The PDF is what you are left with. The quality of a planetary defense force varies so wildly from world to world that attempting to generalize is almost meaningless. On a well-governed Hive world with a planetary governor who takes their defensive responsibilities seriously, the PDF can be a genuinely formidable fighting force. Well-armed, well-trained, equipped with armored vehicles and artillery, and led by officers who have studied military doctrine and understand how to deploy their forces effectively. The Armageddon Steel Legion, before it was formally incorporated into the Astra Militarum, began as a planetary defense force. And its reputation as one of the finest mechanized infantry formations in the Imperium speaks to what a PDF can achieve when it is properly funded and properly led. But many Hive World PDFs are not properly funded, and many are not properly led. The planetary governor has a great deal of discretion in how they allocate resources, and for many governors, the PDF is a line item on a budget that they would rather spend on more personally beneficial projects, like improving the Spire estates or funding the political maneuvers that keep them in power. The result is a fighting force that is often undermanned, poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and led by officers who obtained their commissions through political connections rather than military competence. On some Hive worlds, the PDF is little more than a collection of gang members who have been given uniforms and told to keep order, and whose loyalty to the Imperium extends exactly as far as their next payday. The equipment available to a typical Hive PDF reflects this disparity. The standard weapon of a PDF trooper is usually an auto gun, a simple, reliable, mechanically operated firearm that fires solid projectiles and requires no power cell or specialized maintenance. Autoguns are the workhorses of Imperial infantry armament, easy to manufacture, easy to maintain, and effective enough against unarmored targets at short to medium range. They are not, however, particularly effective against orc armor, tyrannid chitin, or the warped flesh of a chaos-tainted abomination, all of which are things that a Hive PDF trooper may be expected to fight on short notice. Beyond autoguns, the PDF might have access to laser guns, heavy stubbers, a few heavy bolters if they are lucky, and possibly one or two aging armored vehicles that have been in storage since the last time the planet was invaded, which might have been centuries ago. The vehicles may or may not be functional. The heavy weapons may or may not have ammunition. The officers may or may not know how to coordinate a defense larger than a street brawl. This is what stands between the Hive's population and the enemy. Supporting the PDF, in theory at least, are the Adeptus Arbites. The Arbites are the Imperium's law enforcement arm, and their precinct fortresses are some of the most heavily defended positions in any Hive city. Unlike the PDF, which answers to the planetary governor, the Arbites answer directly to the Adeptus Terra on Holy Earth. And this gives them a degree of independence from local politics that makes them valuable in a crisis because their loyalty to the Imperium is not contingent on local conditions. Arbites are well-armed, well-trained, fanatically devoted to the enforcement of Imperial law, and absolutely willing to shoot anyone who gets in their way, a quality that is genuinely useful when the Hive is under attack and the usual rules of engagement have been suspended. But the Arbites are a law enforcement agency, not a military force, and their numbers are small relative to the population they police. A typical Arbite's precinct in a Hive city might house a few hundred officers, which sounds like a lot, until you remember that the Hive's population is measured in the billions. In a full-scale invasion, the Arbites are a valuable but limited resource, capable of holding key positions and conducting targeted operations, but utterly incapable of defending the Hive by themselves. Which brings us to the scratch companies. And this is where the story of Hive City defense becomes genuinely moving, because the scratch companies represent something that no amount of strategic planning or military hardware can replicate: the determination of ordinary people to fight for their home. A scratch company is exactly what it sounds like. A military unit assembled from scratch, composed of civilians who have no formal military training and no business being anywhere near a combat zone. When a hive city's defenses begin to crumble, when the PDF has been overwhelmed and the Arbites are holding their precinct fortresses and the guard has not yet arrived. The hive's population does what populations have always done when faced with extinction. They pick up whatever weapons they can find. They form into groups under whatever leadership is available, and they fight. The composition of a scratch company tells you everything you need to know about the depth of desperation that drives their formation. Manufactorum workers, their hands calloused from years of operating industrial machinery, now wrapped around the grips of autoguns and stub pistols scavenged from abandoned enforcer stations. Hab block administrators, people who have spent their entire careers managing paperwork and processing ration allocations, now standing behind barricades made of overturned furniture and trying to remember the weapons drill they learned in mandatory civil defense training 20 years ago. Underhive gangers, yet the very people that the enforcers have spent years trying to suppress, now fighting alongside those same enforcers against an enemy that threatens both. Even the elderly, the infirm, and the young contribute what they can, carrying ammunition, tending the wounded, maintaining the barricades, performing the 1,000 small tasks that sustain a defense long after the initial adrenaline has faded. The Siege of Vervunhiv, as documented in the Gaunt's Ghosts series by the regimental archivists, provides perhaps the most detailed account of scratch companies in action. When the neighboring hive of Pharazoica, corrupted by chaos, launched its assault on Vervunhiv, the hive's official military forces were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the attack. Over 6 million chaos-tainted soldiers marched on Vervunhiv, was a force that dwarfed the 500,000-strong Vervunhiv defense force. The Imperial Guard reinforcements that eventually arrived, including the legendary Tanith First and Only, under Colonel Commissar Ibram Gaunt, were a welcome addition, but still woefully insufficient to defend the entire perimeter. It was the scratch companies that made the difference. Civilians like Gol Kolea, a deep shaft miner, and Tona Cried, an underhive ganger, formed ad hoc military units from whoever was willing to fight. These units were armed with whatever was available: mining equipment, industrial tools, scavenged weapons, and the sheer bloody-minded determination that comes from defending your home against an enemy that will not stop until everything you know has been destroyed. They fought in the corridors and on the walls and in the manufactorums, in taking casualties that would have broken a professional military unit, and they kept fighting because there was nowhere else to go and no one else to do it. The scratch companies of Vervunhiv suffered terribly. Thousands died. Many of the survivors were wounded, traumatized, changed in ways that would mark them for the rest of their lives. But they held the line long enough for the professional soldiers to do their work. And when the siege finally ended after 54 days of hell, Vervunhiv still stood, battered and broken, but undefeated. The city was declared a necropolis in the aftermath, its damage so severe that it was considered a dead city in all but name. But its people survived, and many of them went on to join the Imperial Guard as replacement soldiers, yet carrying with them the experience and the hard-won toughness that only a siege can forge. This is the pattern of hive city defense across the Imperium. The professionals hold as long as they can, and then the people step up. The gangers who yesterday were fighting the enforcers today fight beside them. The workers who yesterday were counting the hours until their shift ended today count the rounds in their ammunition supply. The divisions that define the hive's social structure, the gulf between spire and underhive, between noble and worker, between law and outlaw, collapse in the face of the common enemy, at least temporarily, at least enough to present a united front against whatever nightmare has come knocking on the hive's gates. It is worth pausing here to consider what this looks like from the inside, from the perspective of someone who is living through it. Because the narratives of hive city sieges tend to focus on the military aspects, the battles and the strategies and the body counts, and they can sometimes lose sight of the human element that gives those narratives their real power. Imagine that you are a manufactorum worker. You have worked the same shift in the same factory for the past 15 years. Your world is approximately 300 meters long by 100 meters wide by 4 levels high, because that is the volume of space that encompasses your hab block, your commute, and your workplace. You have never seen the sky. You have never left the hive. Your ambitions extend no further than earning enough ration credits to keep your family fed and maybe, one day, if the Emperor wills it, in securing a slightly larger hab unit on a slightly higher level, and now you are holding a weapon. An autogun, scavenged from an enforcer who no longer needs it because the enforcer is dead. The weapon is heavier than you expected, and the kickback when you fire it is sharp enough to bruise your shoulder. The barricade you are standing behind is made of hab furniture and broken machinery, and you are fairly certain that it would not stop a determined child, let alone whatever is making those sounds in the corridor ahead of you. The person next to you is a stranger, someone from a different hab block, someone you would never have spoken to under normal circumstances, because the social geography of the hive does not encourage random interactions. But they are here, and they are holding a weapon too, and when they look at you, yet their eyes show the same mixture of terror and determination that you feel in your own chest. This is the reality of a hive city under siege, and it is important because it illustrates something that the grand narratives often miss. The defense of a hive city is not won by the Space Marines who arrive in the third act, though their contribution is undeniably decisive. It is won in the first act by the ordinary people who decide that they would rather die fighting than die running, and who hold the line with their bodies and their courage until help arrives or the enemy breaks. Sometimes help does arrive, and when it does, it arrives with a force that can turn the tide of battle in hours, sometimes minutes. The Astra Militarum is the Imperium's blunt instrument, and when it is deployed in sufficient numbers, it can crush virtually any enemy through the simple application of overwhelming firepower and inexhaustible manpower. Guard regiments are shipped in from across the sector, sometimes from across the segmentum, packed into transport vessels and dropped into war zones with a speed and a scale that would be logistically impossible for any lesser civilization. They bring with them tanks, artillery, aircraft, and the institutional knowledge of 10,000 years of continuous warfare. They are not subtle, and they are not gentle, and the collateral damage they inflict on the hive city they are ostensibly saving can sometimes rival the damage inflicted by the enemy. But they win. The Space Marines are something else entirely. Where the Guard is the Imperium's blunt instrument, the Adeptus Astartes are its scalpel. A single company of Space Marines, 100 warriors in powered armor, can accomplish in hours what a Guard regiment would take days to achieve. They move through the hive's corridors with a speed and a violence that is genuinely shocking to witness, their bolters and chainswords carving a path through the enemy with an efficiency that makes even the most hardened PDF veteran stare in disbelief. They are everything that the Imperium claims its warriors to be: superhuman, invincible, and utterly terrifying. During the siege of Hive Hell's Reach, Reclusiarch Grimaldus and his Black Templars Astartes fought alongside the mortal defenders with a ferocity that became legendary. The Space Marines took up positions on the walls and in the streets, their black and white armor marking them as points of stability in the chaos of battle. For where they stood, the line held. Where they charged, the enemy broke. Their presence alone was enough to stiffen the resolve of the mortal defenders around them, not through any psychic influence or chemical manipulation, but simply through the knowledge that the Emperor's finest were fighting beside them. If the Space Marines had not given up hope, then perhaps there was still a chance. But Space Marines are rare, numbering no more than 1 million across the entire Imperium, and they cannot be everywhere. Many hive cities fight and fall without ever seeing a single Astartes warrior. Many more fight and win without them, relying on the courage and the sacrifice of ordinary human beings who will never appear in the history books, but whose contributions are no less vital for being anonymous. This is the truth of Hive City defense. It is not the work of heroes. It is the work of 1 billion ordinary people doing extraordinary things because there is no other choice. It is the worker who picks up a gun for the first time in their life and stands behind a barricade that they know will not hold. It is the ganger who fights alongside the enforcers who arrested them last month. It is the Hab block administrator who organizes the evacuation of 1,000 families through corridors that are being shelled. It is the tech priest who keeps the generators running with prayers and duct tape while the walls shake around them. It is all of these people acting together in a moment of absolute crisis to defend something that they never fully appreciated until it was being destroyed. And sometimes, despite everything, despite the courage and the sacrifice and the rivers of blood, it is not enough. Hive cities fall. It is one of the most terrible truths of the 41st millennium, and it is one that the Imperium would prefer not to acknowledge. A hive city is not just a building. It is a civilization. It is the sum total of thousands of years of human habitation, of lives lived and children raised, and traditions passed down through generations that stretch back beyond the reach of memory. When a hive city falls, all of that is destroyed, and the destruction is as complete and as irreversible as the extinction of a species. The fall of a hive city to the orcs is perhaps the most visually dramatic. The greenskins, once they have secured control of the major levels, begin the process of remaking the city in their own image. Manufactorums are torn down and rebuilt as crude workshops, their precision machinery replaced by ramshackle devices that produce weapons and vehicles of the characteristically orc aesthetic. Loud, ugly, covered in spikes, and surprisingly effective. The Hab blocks are demolished or repurposed, their neat rows of living units converted into something that resembles a particularly chaotic scrapyard, crossed with a fighting pit. The human population, those who survived the initial assault, are enslaved, put to work in the greenskin workshops, or used as labor in the endless expansion and modification of the city's new orc infrastructure. Life under greenskin occupation is short, brutal, and utterly degrading, a testament to the fact that there are fates worse than death, and the orcs are happy to provide all of them. The fall of a hive city to chaos is a different kind of destruction. It is not physical, or at least not primarily so. The city's structure may survive largely intact, but its soul is corrupted beyond recognition. The imperial insignia are torn down and replaced with the symbols of the dark gods. The chapels are desecrated, their altars turned to purposes that cannot be described in polite company. The population is not enslaved, but converted, drawn into the worship of entities that promise everything and deliver only madness and mutation. The hive continues to function, after a fashion, but what it produces is no longer weapons and ammunition and nutrient paste. What it produces is corruption, spreading outward from the fallen city like ripples from a stone thrown into still water, contaminating everything it touches. And the fall of a hive city to the Tyranids is the most complete destruction of all. Because the Tyranids do not conquer, they do not occupy, they consume. When a Tyranid swarm finishes with a hive city, there is nothing left. Not the buildings, not the machinery, not the people, not even the organic matter in the soil. Everything is broken down into its component biological elements and absorbed into the swarm's biomass, recycled into the raw material for new organisms that will be unleashed on the next target. The hive city simply ceases to exist, replaced by a barren, sterile wasteland that bears no trace of the billions of lives that were lived within its walls. These are the stakes of a hive city invasion. This is what the defenders are fighting for when they stand behind their inadequate barricades and fire their worn-out weapons into the advancing enemy. They are not fighting for territory or resources or political advantage. They are fighting for the existence of everything they have ever known, for the survival of a world measured not in square kilometers, but in shared memories and familiar corridors, and the sound of the shift horn in the morning. They are fighting, ultimately, for the right to continue the hum. Let us talk now about what it feels like when the fighting reaches your level. when the distant sounds of battle that have been a background presence for days suddenly become close, immediate, and personal. When the barricade at the end of your corridor becomes the front line, and you become a soldier, whether you wanted to be one or not. There is something else that happens during the defense of a Hive city that we should discuss, because it speaks to the ingenuity of the human spirit when pressed to its absolute limit. The improvised weapons. When the standard armaments run dry, when the laser guns have no more power cells, and the autoguns have no more rounds, and the stubbers have been fired until their barrels warp from the heat, the defenders of a Hive city do not stop fighting. They adapt, they improvise. They turn the Hive itself into a weapon. The manufactorums of a working Hive are filled with tools and materials that were never designed for combat, but that can be repurposed with devastating effectiveness. Mining picks and industrial cutting tools become close combat weapons that can punch through light armor. Welding torches become improvised flamers, short-ranged but terrifyingly effective in the confined corridors where most of the fighting takes place. Industrial solvents and chemical precursors, available in bulk in the processing plants, can be combined into improvised explosive devices that lack the precision of a military frag grenade, but more than compensate with raw destructive force. Pneumatic nail guns, designed for construction work, become surprisingly lethal ranged weapons at close quarters. Their heavy industrial fasteners capable of penetrating carapace armor at short range. The tech priests and the engine seers, those devotees of the machine god who maintain the Hive's mechanical systems, become invaluable assets during a siege that outlasts its ammunition supply. Their understanding of the Hive's infrastructure allows them to weaponize systems that were never intended for violence. Power conduits can be rerouted to create electrified barriers that deliver lethal doses of current to anything that touches them. Steam pipes can be ruptured deliberately to fill corridors with superheated vapor that scalds flesh and obscures vision. Emergency bulkhead doors can be rigged to slam shut on command, creating instant barricades that seal off entire sections of the Hive and trap advancing enemies in kill zones where they can be dealt with at leisure. On Necromunda, where the gang culture of the Underhive has elevated improvised weaponry to an art form, the weapons produced during a siege can be genuinely inspired. Yet the clan houses of Necromunda have spent centuries developing proprietary technologies that blur the line between industrial equipment and military hardware, and their expertise in turning everyday tools into instruments of death is unmatched anywhere in the Imperium. House Goliath fighters, bred for strength and enhanced with industrial-grade stimulants, wield weapons forged in the same furnaces that produce the Hive's structural components, massive hammers and cleavers, and powered presses that can crush an armored opponent flat. House Van Saar fighters, possessed of a technological sophistication that would impress an Adeptus Mechanicus Magos, produce energy weapons and force fields from salvaged components that should not work together, but somehow do. House Escher fighters specialize in toxins and chemical weapons. Their intimate knowledge of the Hive's biochemical resources, allowing them to produce poisons that can incapacitate or kill virtually any organism. The resourcefulness of Hive city defenders under siege extends beyond weapons to tactics. When conventional military doctrine fails, as it inevitably does in the anarchic environment of a Hive under assault, the defenders develop their own methods, techniques born of desperation and refined through the brutal process of trial and error. Sewer networks become rapid transit routes, allowing defenders to move between positions without exposing themselves to enemy fire in the corridors above. Ventilation shafts become observation posts, their narrow confines providing concealment for spotters who relay enemy positions to the defenders below. Elevator shafts become vertical ambush sites, at their long dark drops providing the perfect environment for a surprise attack on enemies moving between levels. The children of the Hive, as we mentioned earlier, play their own role in these improvisations. Too small to fight, they serve as messengers, squeezing through gaps in barricades and crawling through maintenance ducts that adult fighters cannot fit through, carrying orders and intelligence reports between defensive positions that have been cut off from each other by enemy advances. They know the Hive's hidden spaces with an intimacy that even the gangs cannot match, because children are natural explorers. And in a Hive city, the spaces between the walls are the only frontier left to explore. During the siege, this knowledge becomes a strategic asset, be it a living communication network that operates below the enemy's notice and that no amount of electronic jamming can disrupt. These improvisations and adaptations are not recorded in the official campaign histories. The Administratum does not track the number of orcs killed by repurposed welding torches, or the number of messages carried through ventilation ducts by 10-year-old children. But they are as much a part of the story of Hive City defense as the grand strategic decisions and the heroic last stands, and they deserve to be remembered because they represent something that no army and no fortification can replicate: the sheer, stubborn, creative determination of human beings who refuse to die quietly. Urban warfare in the 41st millennium is not like urban warfare in any previous era of human history. The scale alone defies comparison. When fighting erupts inside a Hive city, the battlefield is not a city block or a neighborhood or even an entire town. It is a vertical landscape that extends for kilometers in every direction, including up and down, a three-dimensional maze of corridors and stairwells and ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels and sealed rooms and open plazas and manufactorum floors and hab block towers, all interconnected by a network of transit routes so complex that even the people who have lived in the Hive their entire lives cannot claim to know it all. The Hive is its own world, and fighting inside it is like fighting inside a world turned inside out, where the sky is a ceiling and the ground is a floor and the horizon is the wall at the end of the corridor. The corridors are where most of the fighting happens, and the corridors of a Hive city are nothing like the clean, well-lit hallways that you might imagine. They are industrial spaces designed for the movement of goods and people in bulk, wide enough in the main transit arteries to accommodate heavy vehicles and narrow enough in the secondary routes to create bottlenecks that can be held by a handful of defenders. The walls are bare rockcrete, grey and featureless, marked with the accumulated graffiti and damage of centuries. The floors are metal grating over maintenance spaces that house power conduits and waste pipes and ventilation ducts, and the grating vibrates under your feet with the passage of every person and every vehicle, producing a constant low-frequency tremor that you feel in your teeth. The lighting is provided by lumen strips, thin bars of cold white light recessed into the ceiling at regular intervals. Under normal circumstances, the lumen strips provide a flat, shadowless illumination that is adequate for navigation, but aesthetically depressing. Under siege conditions, the lumen strips become unreliable, flickering and dying as the power grid takes damage, plunging entire sections of corridor into darkness, and then bringing them back with a stuttering, strobing effect that makes everything look like a series of still images played in rapid succession. Fighting in flickering lumen light is a disorienting experience because every flash shows you a frozen snapshot of the battle around you. A greenskin with its chopper raised, a defender falling backward with a wound in their chest. As a burst of last fire tracing a line of light through the dusty air, and then darkness again, and the sounds continue without the visual context, and your imagination fills in the gaps with things that are worse than reality. The air in a Hive under siege is a weapon in itself. Under normal circumstances, the air recyclers maintain a breathable atmosphere throughout the Hive's inhabited levels, scrubbing out the worst of the industrial pollutants and maintaining a temperature that is uncomfortable but survivable. When the Hive comes under attack, the air recyclers are among the first systems to suffer, either from direct damage or from the diversion of power to defensive systems. As the recyclers fail, the air quality degrades rapidly, filling with smoke from fires, dust from structural damage, chemical fumes from ruptured storage tanks, and the thick, iron smell of blood. Rebreather masks become essential equipment, and the supply of functional rebreathers becomes one of the most critical logistical challenges of the defense. A defender without a rebreather in a heavily damaged section of the hive will be incapacitated by the fumes within minutes and dead within an hour. The enemy, depending on its nature, may not share this vulnerability. Orcs breathe the foul air with apparent indifference. Tyrannid organisms have no conventional respiratory system, and chaos cultists, particularly those devoted to the plague god Nurgle, may actually thrive in atmospheres that would kill an unprotected human. The barricades that punctuate the corridors at defensive positions are improvised from whatever materials are available, and they range from the professionally constructed to the frankly absurd. A well-prepared defensive position might feature overturned cargo haulers filled with rockcrete rubble, providing decent cover against small arms fire and even some protection against explosive ordnance. A poorly prepared position might be nothing more than a stack of hab unit furniture, a few sheets of corrugated metal, and a prayer that the Emperor is watching. The best barricades incorporate fields of fire that allow defenders to cover the approach with overlapping arcs of las and auto fire, creating a kill zone that forces the enemy to advance through sustained firepower before they can reach melee range. The worst barricades are little more than psychological props, barriers that provide the illusion of safety without the substance. If fighting at the barricade is close, dirty, and personal, the ranges are measured in meters, not hundreds of meters, and at those distances, every weapon in the defender's arsenal becomes effective, but none becomes decisive. Laser guns snap and hiss, their beams invisible to the naked eye, but visible as bright flashes where they impact flesh or armor. Autoguns chatter, their solid rounds punching through light cover with a sharp, cracking sound that echoes off the corridor walls. Stub pistols bark at close range, their heavy slugs doing devastating damage at the cost of accuracy and rate of fire. And when the enemy reaches the barricade, when the corridor fills with howling bodies and flailing weapons, and the fighting becomes hand to hand, the weapons that matter are not guns at all, but knives and clubs and industrial tools, and bare fists and teeth, and the raw animal desperation of a human being, fighting for their life in a space so confined that there is literally nowhere to run. The fighting moves through the hive in waves, advancing and retreating as one side gains a temporary advantage and then loses it. A corridor is held, then lost, then retaken, then lost again. A hab block is cleared of enemies, floor by floor, room by room, a painstaking process that costs lives on both sides, and that must be repeated when the enemy infiltrates through the ventilation system and reoccupies the rooms that were cleared an hour ago. A manufactorum becomes a fortress, its heavy machinery providing cover and its loading bays serving as choke points that the defenders can hold with concentrated firepower until the enemy finds a way around the choke points or simply brings enough force to bull through them. The vertical dimension adds a layer of complexity that flat urban warfare does not possess. The enemy can attack from above, dropping through access hatches and ventilation shafts to land behind defensive positions that were oriented to face a horizontal threat. They can attack from below, emerging from the maintenance tunnels and sewer systems that run beneath every level of the hive, appearing in corridors that the defenders thought were secure. They can use the hive's own elevator shafts and stairwells to move between levels, launching attacks from unexpected directions and forcing the defenders to maintain a vigilance that is physically and psychologically exhausting. A defender in a hive city must think in 3 dimensions at all times, and 3-dimensional thinking does not come naturally to beings that evolved on the surface of a planet. The sounds of a hive under siege form a soundscape that survivors carry with them for the rest of their lives. The crack and hiss of las fire, the staccato rattle of autogun bursts, the deep, percussive thump of heavy bolter rounds detonating, the rising whistle and shattering crash of mortar shells hitting rockcrete. the scream of tortured metal as structural supports fail and entire sections of corridor collapse. The endless background rumble of fires burning in levels above and below. The crying of children in the evacuation corridors. The chanting of the devotional that plays continuously over the Voxnet. The voices of the choir maintaining their hymn to the Emperor, even as the walls shake and the lumen strips flicker and the world comes apart around them. And beneath all of these sounds, growing fainter as the siege continues and the generators take more damage, the hum. The Hive's heartbeat, slowing, weakening, but not yet stopped. The defenders develop routines because the human mind demands structure even in the midst of chaos. Sleep becomes a rationed commodity, measured in hours, snatched between shifts at the barricade. Food is whatever can be found. Nutrient bars from emergency stockpiles, canned rations from PDF stores, and, as the siege drags on and supplies dwindle, our increasingly creative improvisations that taste terrible but provide the calories needed to keep fighting. Water is a constant concern, especially if the enemy has managed to contaminate or cut off the Hive's water recycling systems. Medical care is provided by whoever has some training and whatever supplies are available, which means that wounds that would be trivially treatable in a well-equipped medical facility become life-threatening, and life-threatening wounds become death sentences. The social dynamics of the defense are fascinating and heartbreaking in equal measure. The hierarchies that defined the Hive's peacetime society dissolve in the heat of combat, replaced by a simpler, more brutal ordering based on competence and courage. The manufacturum foreman, who was a petty tyrant in peacetime, becomes a valued leader in wartime, all because their ability to organize and motivate a workforce translates directly into the ability to organize and motivate a defensive position. The Underhive ganger, who was a menace to civil order in peacetime, becomes a hero in wartime because their intimate knowledge of the Hive's hidden passages and their experience with violence make them invaluable scouts and infiltrators. The Spire noble, who was a figure of resentment and envy in peacetime, becomes either a liability or a revelation in wartime, depending on whether they choose to cower in their estates or descend to the barricades and fight alongside the workers they once looked down upon. Children adapt to the siege with a resilience that is both admirable and deeply disturbing. They learn to sleep through explosions. Yet they learn to navigate the evacuation corridors without adult supervision, finding their way through the maze of the Hive's interior levels with an instinctive sense of direction that their parents envy. They learn to identify the sounds of different weapons and to distinguish between incoming fire, which requires immediate shelter, and outgoing fire, which does not. They play games that are disturbingly specific to their circumstances. Orcs versus guard, cultist versus Arbites, their small voices raised in imitation battle cries, and their small hands clutching toy weapons fashioned from scrap. The siege becomes their normal, because children are infinitely adaptable, and because the only alternative to adaptation is a kind of existential despair that the young mind is not yet equipped to process. The elderly, by contrast, and often find the siege easier to bear, not because they are tougher, but because they have less to lose. A 70-year-old manufacturing worker who has spent their entire life inside the Hive, who has seen shifts change and friends die and children grow up, and the Hive itself change around them in ways too gradual to notice and too profound to ignore, brings to the siege a perspective that the young cannot match. They have seen hard times before. They know that the Hive has survived crises in the past, and they have faith, not just the theological faith in the Emperor, though that is real and important, but the practical faith of experience, the knowledge that things that seem impossible to endure are nonetheless endured, and that the morning comes even after the longest night. It is the people in the middle. They are the adults with families and responsibilities and futures that they can see slipping away, who bear the heaviest psychological burden. They are the ones who lie awake at night, listening to the distant sounds of battle and trying to calculate the trajectory of the enemy's advance, trying to determine whether the defensive line at the end of the corridor will hold for another day or another hour, trying to decide whether it is better to stay and fight, or to take their family deeper into the hive, and hope that the depth provides safety. They are the ones who make the impossible choices, whether to spend their last water ration on their children, or save it for the fighters at the barricade, whether to carry the wounded co-worker who cannot walk, or leave them behind and run, and whether to use the last power cell in their weapon to fire at the enemy, or save it for themselves in case the enemy breaks through. These are the decisions that define a hive city under siege, and they are made not by generals and commissars, but by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Every survivor of a hive siege carries with them a burden of choices made and not made, of people helped and people left behind, of moments of courage and moments of cowardice, and the vast grey area between them where most human behavior actually lives. The heroism of the siege is not the heroism of the recruitment posters, all gleaming armor and righteous fury. It is the heroism of the parent who feeds their children first. It is the heroism of the worker who stays at the barricade for one more hour, even though every fiber of their being is screaming at them to run. It is the heroism of the ganger who carries a stranger's child through a corridor filled with smoke and lass fire, not because they are brave, but because the child was there and someone had to carry them. The siege reaches its crisis point differently depending on the enemy and the circumstances, but there is a common pattern that repeats across 1,000 worlds and 1,000 conflicts. There is a moment, usually arriving in the darkest hours of the defense, when the situation seems hopeless. The outer levels have fallen. The defensive lines are crumbling. Ammunition is running low. The generators are failing. The hum is dying. A Vox transmission cuts through the barricade and see in each other's faces the same unspoken question: is this the end? And then, sometimes, the answer comes from an unexpected direction. A Vox transmission cuts through the static, carrying a voice that speaks with an authority that the battered defenders have almost forgotten existed. Imperial reinforcements are en route. Hold your positions. The Emperor protects. Sometimes the reinforcements arrive in time. A thunderhawk screams down through the hive's ruptured upper levels, its engines roaring, its weapons blazing, disgorging space marines who hit the enemy like a power fist hitting a clay wall. A column of Lehman Russ battle tanks grinds through the hive's main transit corridor, their battle cannons obliterating everything in their path. A regiment of the Imperial Guard, fresh from the transport ships in orbit, pours through the hive's gates with the relentless momentum of a force that has been told to advance and intends to do exactly that, regardless of what is in the way. The effect on the defenders is electric. People who have been fighting for days without sleep, without proper food or water, without any assurance that their sacrifice will make a difference, are suddenly galvanized by the knowledge that they are not alone. The line that was on the verge of breaking steadies. The barricade that was about to be overrun holds for one more hour, and then another, and then the Space Marines arrive, and the enemy that seemed unstoppable an hour ago is suddenly being driven back, their casualties mounting with every meter of corridor they try to hold. The relief of a besieged hive city is not a clean, but decisive moment. It is a process, a gradual turning of the tide that plays out over days and weeks as the reinforcements systematically clear the hive level by level, corridor by corridor, room by room. The fighting does not stop because the reinforcements have arrived. If anything, it intensifies because the enemy knows that their window of opportunity is closing and fights with a desperate ferocity that makes the earlier phases of the siege seem almost sedate by comparison. But the momentum has shifted, and the defenders know it, and that knowledge is a weapon in itself, more powerful than any lasgun or bolter, because it means that the sacrifices they have made were not in vain. Sometimes the reinforcements do not arrive in time, and that is a different story, as a story that is told in empty hab blocks and abandoned manufactorums, and the silence of a hive that has stopped humming forever. When a hive city falls, the survivors, if there are survivors, carry with them more than physical wounds. They carry the memory of a world destroyed, a world that existed only inside those walls and that can never be rebuilt, because the people who made it are dead or scattered, and the knowledge they carried, the million small customs and habits and relationships that constituted the Hive's culture, are gone. A Hive city is not just a building that can be repaired. It is a community of billions, and when that community is shattered, what is lost is not just the physical structure, but the accumulated human experience of 10,000 years of continuous habitation. The refugees from a fallen Hive are among the most pitiful sights in the Imperium. They emerge from the ruins in ragged columns, carrying whatever they could grab in the final minutes before the end, stumbling through the ash wastes toward whatever neighboring Hive or refugee camp or transport vessel might offer them temporary salvation. They are filthy, exhausted, traumatized, and they carry with them diseases and mutations and, in some cases, the seeds of the very corruption that destroyed their home. The neighboring Hives are rarely welcoming. Resources are scarce, space is limited, and the fear of contamination, both biological and spiritual, makes the established population hostile to newcomers. The refugees are packed into camps on the outskirts of the surviving Hives, or crammed into the already overcrowded lower levels, or simply left to fend for themselves in the ash wastes, which is essentially a death sentence delivered with the quiet efficiency that the Imperium has perfected over 10 millennia. But Hive cities are also rebuilt, not always and not quickly, but with a stubborn persistence that speaks to the fundamental resilience of the human species, even in the grim darkness of the far future. The Imperium cannot afford to lose the productive capacity that a Hive city represents. The manufactorums must be restarted, the generators must be repaired, the tithe quotas must be met. And so, the rebuilding begins, sometimes even before the fighting has fully stopped, with tech priests and engineers and work gangs moving into the damaged levels and beginning the long, slow process of making the Hive habitable again. As the rebuilt Hive is never the same as the old one. The physical structure can be repaired, but the social fabric that gave the Hive its character cannot be replaced. New workers are brought in from other worlds, strangers who do not know the corridors or the customs or the stories that the old inhabitants passed down through the generations. New gangs form in the Underhive, displacing the remnants of the old ones and establishing new territories and new hierarchies. New noble houses rise in the spires, their wealth built on the rebuilding contracts and the exploitation of the rebuilt manufactorums. The Hive lives again, but it is a different life, and the people who remember the old Hive carry that memory with them, like a wound that never fully heals. There is one more thing that needs to be said about Hive city invasions, and it is perhaps the most important thing of all. Hive cities are not passive victims. They are not simply targets to be destroyed or prizes to be won. They are living communities of human beings who have been shaped by the extraordinary conditions of their existence into something tough and resilient and stubbornly, magnificently alive. The workers who man the barricades are not soldiers, but they fight with a courage that puts professional armies to shame. The gangers who defend their turf against alien invaders are not heroes, but they perform acts of heroism that would be celebrated for centuries if anyone thought to record them. The ordinary, unremarkable, utterly anonymous citizens of the Hive, the people who will never appear in any history book and whose names will never be spoken in any hall of remembrance, are the ones who actually win the sieges and defend the walls and keep the hum going when everything else is falling apart. This is the truth that the Imperium does not always acknowledge, because it does not fit neatly into the narrative of Space Marines and Imperial Guard and the grand sweep of galactic war. The truth is that the Imperium of Man survives not because of its armies, powerful as they are, or its navies, vast as they are, or its faith, fervent as it is. The Imperium survives because of its people, the countless billions who live and work and fight and die inside their metal mountains, who endure conditions that would break any lesser species, and who refuse, with a stubbornness that borders on the irrational, to give up. When your Hive city gets invaded, This is what you become. Not a hero, not a legend, just a person. He's standing in a corridor, holding a weapon you barely know how to use, listening to the sounds of something terrible approaching, and choosing to stand your ground. Not because you are brave, not because you are strong, not because you believe, with any real confidence, that you are going to survive, but because this is your home, these are your people, and someone has to hold the line. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, and the endless, grinding march of armies across the stars, that simple choice, the choice to stand and fight for what is yours, is perhaps the most human thing there is. The hive endures. The hum continues. The shift horn sounds, and a billion people rise from their cots and step into the corridors and begin another day, because that is what they have always done, and that is what they will continue to do until the very last light in the very last corridor goes dark. And even then, even in the darkness, someone will be listening for the hum. If you enjoyed this journey through the hive, if you felt the vibration of the shift horn and the weight of the autogun in your hands and the close, stale air of the corridors pressing in around you, then I would be grateful if you would consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Every like and every subscription helps us continue to bring you these deep dives into the lore and the atmosphere of the 41st millennium, and it lets us know that you want more stories from the dark corners of the Imperium. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, as a corner of the lore that you think deserves the same kind of immersive, atmospheric treatment, let us know in the comments. We read every one, and your suggestions shape what we create. Until next time, keep your rebreather close, your laser gun charged, and your faith in the Emperor strong. The hive endures. And so do we. We have spoken about the broad strokes of a hive city invasion, the thundering arrival of the greenskin horde, the insidious creep of chaos corruption, the biological horror of the tyrannid swarm. But there are details that matter, textures and nuances that give the experience its full terrible weight, and we would be doing the subject a disservice if we did not explore them. Let us talk about the food supply, because when a hive city comes under siege, food becomes the most powerful weapon that neither side deliberately deploys, but both sides inevitably use. A hive city consumes resources at a rate that is difficult to comprehend. A population of 1 billion souls requires millions of tons of food every single day, and that food does not grow inside the hive. Hive cities are, by definition, places where natural agriculture is impossible. The land around them, if it has not been converted into industrial wasteland, is typically the surface of a world so thoroughly consumed by urbanization that the very concept of a farm is as alien to its inhabitants as the concept of open sky. The food comes from outside, from agri-worlds that specialize in mass food production, shipped across the stars in enormous bulk freighters and distributed through the hive's internal supply chain with a precision that the administratum considers one of its crowning logistical achievements. When the supply lines are cut, and they are always cut during a siege because cutting supply lines is one of the first things any competent invader does, the hive begins to starve. Not immediately, because hive cities maintain emergency stockpiles, vast warehouses in the lower levels filled with ration packs and nutrient bars and sealed containers of water purification chemicals. These stockpiles are, in theory, sufficient to sustain the population for weeks, perhaps even months, depending on the size of the hive and the diligence of the administrators who maintain the reserves. In practice, and the stockpiles are rarely as well maintained as they should be. Corruption, neglect, and the simple passage of time erode the reserves. And when the crisis comes, the administrators discover that the warehouses are half empty, the ration packs have expired, and the water purification chemicals have degraded into something that is more toxic than the water it was supposed to clean. The rationing begins immediately, and it is ruthless. The authorities, whoever is in charge of the defense, calculate the available food supply, divide it by the estimated duration of the siege, and allocate rations accordingly. Fighters receive the largest share because they need the calories to maintain their combat effectiveness. Civilians receive less. The elderly, the infirm, and the very young receive even less. It's because in the brutal arithmetic of survival, they are the least productive and the most expendable. This is not a decision that anyone makes lightly or willingly, but it is a decision that must be made, and the people who make it carry the weight of it for the rest of their lives. As the siege drags on and the rations shrink, the social order of the hive begins to change. Food becomes the most valuable commodity in the city, more valuable than weapons, more valuable than information, more valuable than water, though water runs a close second. Black markets emerge, shadowy networks of traders and middlemen who deal in hoarded rations and stolen supplies, charging prices that would be obscene under normal circumstances, and that seem almost reasonable when the alternative is watching your children go hungry. The gangs that controlled the Underhive's economy in peacetime find their skills and their networks suddenly indispensable, and some of them leverage this advantage into positions of genuine power within the siege hierarchy. Others take advantage of the chaos to settle old scores or seize new territory, adding internal conflict to the external threat and forcing the defenders to fight on yet another front. The hunger changes people. It changes the way they think, the way they behave, the way they relate to each other. People who were generous in peacetime become hoarders in siege. People who were honest become thieves. People who were kind become callous, not because they have lost their kindness, but because the survival instinct has overridden every other impulse. And the only thing that matters is making it through the day and making sure the people you love make it through the day too. The moral landscape of the hive flattens under the weight of hunger, and the distinctions between right and wrong that seemed so clear and so important in peacetime become blurred to the point of irrelevance. There are stories from the siege of Hive Hades during the Second War for Armageddon that illustrate this with painful clarity. Commissar Yarrick, who organized the defense with an iron will and an artificial power claw, maintained discipline with a combination of inspiration and terror that kept the garrison fighting long after morale should have collapsed. But even Yarrick could not control the civilian population's response to starvation. Fights broke out at the ration dispensaries, as not between gangs or criminals but between ordinary families, parents struggling with each other for the extra nutrient bar that might keep their child alive for one more day. The enforcers broke up these fights, sometimes with stun batons, sometimes with live ammunition, and each incident eroded the social cohesion that the defenders desperately needed to maintain. The water supply presents its own set of problems. A hive city's water comes from a closed recycling system that processes wastewater through a series of filters and chemical treatments, producing output that is technically drinkable, if not exactly pleasant. This system requires power to operate, and power is often one of the first casualties of a siege. As the water recyclers go offline, the hive's water reserves begin to deplete, and the symptoms of dehydration add themselves to the symptoms of starvation: headaches, confusion, muscle cramps, reduced cognitive function, all of which degrade the defenders' ability to fight at precisely the time when they need to be at their sharpest. On worlds where the enemy has deliberately targeted the water supply, the situation is even worse. The admonition cult in Hive Tertium seized control of the water recycling infrastructure and used it to distribute Nurgle-tainted pathogens throughout the hive, turning the very thing that kept the population alive into a vector for disease and corruption. The defenders were forced to choose between drinking potentially contaminated water and dying of thirst, a choice that is no choice at all. And the resulting plague added a biological dimension to the military crisis that stretched the hive's already overstrained medical resources beyond their breaking point. Disease is, in fact, one of the most reliable killers in a hive city under siege, and it kills more surely and more indiscriminately than any weapon. The conditions that produce disease, overcrowding, poor sanitation, malnutrition, stress, exposure to industrial pollutants, are the normal conditions of hive life, amplified to breaking point by the pressures of the siege. Epidemics that would have been contained under normal circumstances by the Hive's medical infrastructure, inadequate as it is, become uncontrollable when the medical stations are overwhelmed with combat casualties and the supply of basic medicines has been exhausted, and infections that would have been treated with a simple dose of counterspetics become death sentences when the counterspetics have run out and the nearest resupply is on the other side of an enemy-held corridor. The casualties from disease are invisible in the grand narrative of the siege, but they are often greater than the casualties from combat. For every defender who dies at the barricade with a weapon in their hands, there are 3 or 4 who die in the overcrowded refugee centers, or the makeshift medici wards, or the sealed HAB units where families huddle together and pray and try not to cough too loudly, because the cough might be the first symptom of something that will kill them all within a week. Let us talk about the psychological dimension of a Hive city under siege, and it's because the mental toll is as devastating as the physical one and receives far less attention in the official accounts. The constant noise is the first thing. Hive cities are always noisy, but the noise of a city under siege is qualitatively different from the noise of a city at peace. The familiar sounds, the hum of the generators, the rumble of the manufactorums, the murmur of the crowds in the transit corridors are replaced by the sounds of war, the crack of lasfire, the thump of explosions, the high-pitched whine of damaged power conduits, the screaming. The screaming is the worst part, because it is human, recognizably and inescapably human, and it comes from everywhere. Filtered through the Hive's corridors and ventilation shafts into an omnipresent background of agony that you cannot escape, no matter how deep into the interior you go. Sleep deprivation becomes universal within days. The noise alone would be sufficient to prevent restful sleep, but it is compounded by the anxiety that sleep invites, the fear of being caught unaware by a sudden breach, the knowledge that the defensive line might collapse while you are unconscious, the simple animal terror of closing your eyes in a place where danger can come from any direction at any time. People develop coping mechanisms that border on the pathological, sleeping in shifts of 20 minutes, never fully unconscious, one hand on their weapon, their dreams infected by the sounds that penetrate even the deepest sleep. But the accumulated sleep debt degrades cognitive function, erodes emotional resilience, and creates a state of chronic hypervigilance that is almost indistinguishable from clinical anxiety. The uncertainty is the second great psychological weapon. In an open battlefield, a soldier can see the enemy. They can assess the threat, calculate the odds, make informed decisions about their course of action. In a Hive city under siege, information is scarce, unreliable, and often deliberately distorted. The Voxnet, if it is still functioning, carries a mixture of official updates, wild rumors, and, if the enemy is sophisticated enough, propaganda designed to undermine morale. The defenders at a barricade on level 47 know what is happening in their corridor and perhaps in the adjoining ones. But they have no idea what is happening 3 levels up or 10 levels down. They do not know whether the defensive line on level 40 has held or collapsed. They do not know whether reinforcements are coming. They do not know whether the Hive is winning or losing, or even what winning and losing would look like in the context of their immediate situation. This uncertainty breeds rumors, and the rumors propagate through the Hive's population with a speed that would impress a Vox operator. The orcs have broken through on the eastern wall. No, they have been pushed back. No, they have not been pushed back. They have been reinforced, and now they are advancing on level 30. The Space Marines are coming. The Space Marines are already here, fighting on the upper levels. But the Space Marines are not coming because they have been diverted to another war zone. The planetary governor has fled. The planetary governor is dead. The planetary governor is alive and leading the defense from the command bunker. Each rumor creates a wave of hope or despair that washes through the population and is replaced within hours by the next rumor, which contradicts the first, and the cumulative effect is a state of emotional exhaustion that is as debilitating as any physical wound. The religious dimension of the siege experience deserves particular attention because faith is one of the most powerful forces in the 41st millennium. and it is never more powerful than in the extremity of a siege. The Imperial Creed, the official religion of the Imperium, teaches that the God Emperor watches over all his subjects, and that suffering endured in his name is a form of worship that will be rewarded in the afterlife. This belief is a source of genuine comfort to the defenders, not because it removes their fear, but because it gives their fear a context, a meaning, a purpose. They are not suffering randomly. They are suffering for the Emperor, and the Emperor sees their sacrifice and values it. The devotional services that continue throughout the siege are among the most important morale-sustaining activities that the defenders engage in. The preachers, those ecclesiarchy-trained ministers who tend the spiritual needs of the Hive's population, perform their duties with a dedication that is often heroic in itself. They move through the barricades and the refugee centers and the medici wards, as offering prayers and blessings and the simple comfort of a presence that represents something larger and more enduring than the immediate crisis. They lead the hymns that echo through the corridors, voices raised in praise of the Emperor that drown out, at least momentarily, the sounds of battle. They administer last rites to the dying, commending their souls to the Emperor's keeping with a solemnity that gives the act of dying a dignity that the circumstances might otherwise deny it. But faith is a double-edged weapon, and the siege tests it in ways that peacetime worship cannot. The defenders pray for deliverance, and deliverance does not come. They pray for strength, and their bodies fail them. They pray for the Emperor's protection, and the people next to them die screaming. As the gap between the promises of the creed and the reality of the siege is a space in which doubt grows, and doubt in the 41st millennium is not just a personal failing. It is a crack in the spiritual armor of the species, a gap through which the enemies of mankind can insert their influence. Chaos exploits this vulnerability with a precision that speaks to the ruinous power's intimate understanding of human psychology. A tired, hungry, frightened, doubting defender is a prime target for the whispered promises of the dark gods, who offer power and relief and vengeance in exchange for a simple act of betrayal. The chaos cults that operate within besieged hive cities prey on exactly these weaknesses, till offering their message of liberation and empowerment to people who are at the lowest point of their existence and who are desperate enough to listen to anyone who promises a way out. This is why the commissars are so important and so feared. The commissar's role in a siege is not just military, it is psychological. The commissar stands behind the line, bolt pistol in hand, and their presence sends a message that is as simple as it is brutal. You will fight, or you will die, and if you are going to die either way, at least die facing the enemy and not the commissar. It is not a gentle motivation, and it is not a humane one, but in the extremity of a siege, when the defenders are exhausted and terrified, and the barricade is about to fall, and the only thing standing between the enemy and the civilian population is a thin line of broken, bleeding, barely conscious human beings, the commissar's presence is often the difference between a line that holds and a line that breaks. Commissar Yarrick's defense of Hades' Hive during the Second War for Armageddon is the textbook example. Yarrick understood, perhaps better than any commissar before or since, that the role was not about shooting cowards, but about embodying the will to resist. His presence on the walls, his artificial power claw gleaming in the firelight, his voice carrying over the din of battle with a clarity that seemed to cut through the noise rather than compete with it, became a symbol that the defenders rallied around when everything else had failed. Yarrick did not just lead the defense of Hades' Hive, he personified it. He became the embodiment of the Hive's refusal to die, and even the orcs came to fear him, which is remarkable, given that orcs do not typically fear anything. The role of the Adeptus Astartes in the morale equation is somewhat different. Where the commissar motivates through fear and duty, the Space Marine motivates through inspiration and awe. The sight of a Space Marine in full battle plate, striding through a corridor that has been contested for days, bolter in one hand and combat blade in the other, is a vision that reaches past the rational mind and speaks directly to the mythological consciousness of the human species. The Space Marine is not just a soldier. They are a demigod, a living incarnation of the Emperor's will, a physical manifestation of the Imperium's power and its promise. Their presence on the battlefield transforms the dynamics of the defense, not through the additional firepower they bring, insignificant as it is, but through the effect they have on the people fighting around them. During the siege of Hive Hellsreach, the presence of Reclusiarch Grimaldus and his Black Templars was described by Imperial Guard officers as having a force-multiplying effect that went far beyond what their numbers would suggest. The Steel Legion troopers who fought alongside the Space Marines reported feeling invincible, not because they literally believed themselves to be immune to harm, but because the psychological effect of fighting beside the Emperor's chosen warriors overrode the fear and exhaustion that had been eroding their combat effectiveness. Where the Space Marines went, the defenders fought harder, held longer, and endured more than they had believed possible. The Space Marines did not just fight the orcs, but they fought the despair that was slowly killing the garrison from within. There is one final psychological dimension of the siege that we must address, and it is the most difficult to talk about, because it involves a truth that the Imperium would very much prefer to keep quiet. It is the aftermath, the period after the siege has ended, when the guns have fallen silent, and the enemy has been driven back or destroyed, and the survivors emerge from their shelters and their barricades and look around at what remains of their world. The syndrome is not officially recognized by the Imperium's medical establishment, because the Imperium's medical establishment is more concerned with treating the physical consequences of warfare than the psychological ones, and because admitting that loyal Imperial citizens can be mentally broken by the experience of defending their homes against the Emperor's enemies would imply a weakness in the Imperial character that the authorities are not prepared to acknowledge. But it exists, and it is widespread, and it manifests in symptoms that are as predictable as they are devastating. Nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, difficulty forming connections with other people, a pervasive sense of guilt that stems from the belief that they should have done more, fought harder, saved more lives, and the consuming, inextinguishable memory of everything they saw and heard and did during the siege. The survivors of the siege of Vervenhiv were described as people who had been hollowed out, present in body but absent in spirit, at going through the motions of reconstruction and recovery, but unable to fully engage with a world that no longer made sense to them. Many of them volunteered for the Imperial Guard, not because they wanted to continue fighting, but because they could not imagine doing anything else. Because the skills they had developed during the siege, the ability to fight and kill and endure, were the only skills they now possessed, and because the camaraderie of military service was the only social environment in which their experiences were understood and their behavior made sense. They became Gaunt's ghosts, the Tanith first and only, carrying with them the memory of a hive that had been declared dead and the knowledge that they had helped to kill it and save it in equal measure. This is the legacy of a Hive City invasion, and not the tactical lessons learned, or the strategic implications assessed, or the military records filed. The legacy is the people, changed and broken and scarred in ways that no medici can heal, carrying the weight of their experience through the rest of their lives, like a piece of shrapnel too deeply embedded to be safely removed. They are the real veterans of the Hive Wars, and their stories, told quietly in the corners of mess halls and in the darkness of HAB units, long after the lights have been dimmed, are the truest accounts of what it means to be human in the 41st millennium. Let us speak now about the particular experience of the Spire during an invasion, because the people who live at the top of the Hive have their own version of this story, and it is not the version you might expect. But the nobility of the Spire occupy a position in the Hive's social architecture that is both physically elevated and emotionally detached from the realities of life below. They live above the clouds, in some cases literally, their estates bathed in natural sunlight that the workers in the manufactorums below have never seen. They breathe air that has been filtered and scented by systems so sophisticated that the atmosphere in a spire estate is cleaner and more pleasant than the air on most agri-worlds. They eat food that has been imported from across the sector, prepared by artisans who have dedicated their lives to the culinary arts, and served on plates that cost more than a factory worker will earn in a lifetime. Their days are occupied not with production quotas and shift schedules, but with the elaborate social rituals of the imperial nobility. Balls and banquets, political alliances and vendettas, the endless, intricate dance of power that determines which families rise and which families fall. When the invasion comes, the spire families face a crisis that is qualitatively different from the one faced by the workers below. For the workers, the invasion is an external threat that destroys their already difficult existence. For the nobility, it is an existential challenge that strips away the carefully maintained illusions that define their lives and forces them to confront realities that they have spent their entire existence avoiding. The first reality is that the spire cannot be defended independently. The walls and the gates and the defensive batteries that protect the hive are located at the base, not the top, and they are manned by the PDF and the workers, not the nobility. The spire's security depends entirely on the integrity of the lower levels, and when those levels are breached, the spire is exposed in a way that its inhabitants find deeply unsettling. They are accustomed to looking down on the hive, both literally and metaphorically. The idea that the violence and the chaos of the lower levels might actually reach them, might penetrate the security checkpoints and the armored doors that separate the spire from the rest of the hive, is genuinely shocking. The second reality is that their wealth, their political connections, their centuries of accumulated power and privilege will count for nothing when the enemy comes through the door. An orc does not care about your noble lineage. A tyrannid does not distinguish between noble blood and common blood. A chaos cultist may actually target the nobility specifically, seeing them as symbols of the oppression that the cult has sworn to overthrow. The equalizing nature of violence, the brutal truth that a bullet or a claw or a chainsword treats all flesh the same regardless of its social standing, is a reality that the spire nobility has never had to face before. And facing it breaks some of them as thoroughly as the siege breaks the workers below. Some of the nobility respond to the crisis with courage and selflessness that belies their privileged upbringing. They descend from the spire to the fighting levels, bringing with them personal guard units and private arsenals and, in some cases, military training that their families maintained as a tradition even when there was no practical reason for it. These noble warriors fight alongside the workers and the PDF troopers, and their contribution is often significant, not because they are better fighters, but because their presence on the front line sends a message that the entire hive is united in its defense. The noble who descends from the spire to stand at the barricade earns a respect from the workers that no amount of political maneuvering could ever achieve. Others respond differently. They seal themselves in their estates, surround themselves with their personal guard, and wait out the siege in comfort, eating from their private stores while the workers below starve, drinking imported wine while the water recyclers fail, sleeping in feather beds while the defenders die on the barricades. They tell themselves that they are preserving the hive's leadership structure, that their survival is essential for the post-siege reconstruction, that someone must maintain the continuity of governance. These justifications are not entirely wrong, but they ring hollow to the workers who see the sealed doors of the spire and know that behind them, someone is living in comfort while they die in the dark. The political consequences of the siege, the power struggles and the betrayals, and the shifting alliances within the hive's leadership are a subject that could fill volumes of their own. During the siege of Vervenhive, the hive's high master, Salvador Sondar, was a figure of erratic genius who oscillated between brilliant strategic insight and near total mental collapse. The Vervenhive Primary Commissariat, the hive's own military police, spent as much energy jockeying for political advantage as they did fighting the enemy. jealously guarding their authority and undermining the off-world guard officers whose tactical expertise was desperately needed. The arrival of Lord General Storm, the senior Imperial Guard commander, dispatched to reinforce the defense, introduced yet another layer of political complexity, as Storm's primary concern seemed to be advancing his own career rather than saving the Hive. It was left to Colonel Commissar Gaunt, a man whose dual role as both military commander and political officer gave him a unique perspective on the dysfunction, as to cut through the political fog and focus the defense on the only thing that actually mattered: killing the enemy before the enemy killed them. This pattern of political dysfunction during a crisis is not unique to Vervunhive. It is a recurring feature of Hive city sieges across the Imperium, and it stems from the same structural conditions that make Hive cities vulnerable to invasion in the first place. The Hive's power structure is designed for peacetime governance, for the management of production, and the maintenance of social order in a stable environment. It is not designed for the rapid, decisive, coordinated response that a military crisis demands. The planetary governor may be a competent administrator, but a hopeless military commander. The PDF commanders may be skilled tacticians but lack the political authority to override the governor's decisions. The Arbites may have the best intelligence on the situation, but no mechanism for sharing it with the military leadership. And everyone, from the governor to the lowliest Hablok warden, is simultaneously trying to manage the crisis and protect their own position within the hierarchy, because in the Imperium, losing your position is only slightly less terrifying than losing your life. The result is a command structure that often functions more as an obstacle to effective defense than as a facilitator of it. Orders are contradicted, resources are misallocated, reinforcements are sent to the wrong sector, intelligence is hoarded rather than shared, units are given conflicting objectives, and meanwhile, the enemy advances, while exploiting every crack in the defender's coordination with an efficiency that makes the human political dysfunction look almost deliberately self-destructive. This is why the arrival of the Imperial Guard, with its own command structure and its own chain of authority, is so important, and why it is also so disruptive. The Guard brings with it a military professionalism that the Hive's own forces often lack, but it also brings an entirely separate hierarchy that must somehow be integrated with the existing one, and the process of integration is rarely smooth. Guard commanders, accustomed to operating within a military framework where orders are obeyed and authority is respected, find themselves confronted by a civilian leadership that does not understand military operations and is deeply suspicious of outside interference. Yet the resulting friction can paralyze the defense at precisely the moment when unified command is most critical. During the siege of Vervunhive, the friction between the local leadership and the off-world guard forces nearly doomed the city. Lord General Storm vetoed a proposed armoured sortie that Colonel Commissar Gaunt, along with Generals Grismund and Nash, had advocated as a means of delaying the enemy advance. Storm preferred to rely on the city's static defences, a decision that may have been militarily defensible, but that also happened to align neatly with his desire to avoid the personal risk that an offensive operation would entail. The result was a defense that was purely reactive, surrendering the initiative to the enemy and forcing the defenders to absorb the full force of each successive assault, without any opportunity to disrupt the enemy's preparations. It was not until Gaunt, through a combination of political maneuvering and sheer force of personality, managed to effectively take control of the defense that the situation began to improve. And even then, the improvement was slow, painful, and purchased at a cost in lives that a more unified command structure might have avoided. The lesson of Vervunhive, and of 100 other sieges like it, is that the greatest threat to a Hive city under siege is not always the enemy at the gates. Sometimes it is the people behind the barricades, the leaders and administrators and politicians whose inability to subordinate their personal interest to the common good transforms a difficult defense into an impossible one. The Imperium is built on hierarchy, and hierarchy is essential for the governance of a civilization that spans the galaxy. But hierarchy becomes a liability when the crisis demands flexibility, and flexibility is a quality that the Imperium's governance structures are not designed to provide. Let us return now to the physical experience of the siege, because we have spent time with the leadership and the politicians and the strategic overview, and it is time to go back to the corridors, back to the barricades, back to the place where the actual fighting happens and the actual dying is done. There is a moment in every siege when the fighting reaches the residential levels, the hab blocks where the civilian population lives, and this moment marks a transition in the character of the conflict that is as sharp as it is devastating. Up to this point, the fighting has been conducted in industrial spaces and transit corridors, areas that are designed for functionality rather than habitation, areas where the destruction wrought by combat feels like damage to infrastructure rather than damage to homes. When the fighting reaches the hab blocks, the destruction becomes personal. The barricade is made from someone's furniture. The corridor being defended is the corridor that someone's children used to walk to the communal classroom. The room that has just been cleared at the cost of 2 defenders' lives is the room where a family ate their meals and said their prayers and argued about whose turn it was to clean the recycler. The defenders who fight in the hab blocks carry an additional burden that their counterparts in the industrial levels do not. Every room they lose is not just a tactical setback. It is the loss of someone's home. Every wall that is breached by enemy fire is not just a structural failure. It is the destruction of the physical shell that contains someone's life. The fighting in the hab blocks is fighting among the debris of ordinary existence, scattered clothing and broken cookware and children's toys and the devotional icons that every loyal imperial household keeps in a place of honor. Stepping over these things, kicking them aside to clear a firing line or crawling over them to reach a better position, produces a sense of violation that is difficult to describe, but impossible to ignore. You are not just fighting in someone's home, you are destroying it, and the destruction is necessary, and the knowledge that it is necessary does not make it any easier to bear. The civilians who remain in the hab blocks, those who could not or would not evacuate, present the defenders with their most difficult challenge. A hab block is not a military installation. It is not designed with fields of fire and defensive positions and kill zones. It is designed to house people, as many people as possible in as small a space as possible, and its layout reflects this purpose. The corridors are narrow, the rooms are small, the walls are thin, often thin enough that a heavy bolter round will penetrate through 3 or 4 rooms before expending its energy. The civilians who are huddled in these rooms, listening to the fighting move closer and closer, are separated from the combat by walls that offer no more protection than a sheet of cardboard. The defenders must fight around the civilians, which means fighting with one hand tied behind their back. They cannot use heavy weapons in the hab blocks because the collateral damage would kill as many friendlies as enemies. They cannot fall back through rooms that are occupied by non-combatants because retreating through a room full of civilians while being pursued by orcs or tyrannids guarantees a massacre. They cannot even use grenades, the most effective weapon in close quarters fighting, and because the blast radius in a confined space will catch everyone within 15 meters, friend and foe, and civilian alike. Every tactical decision is complicated by the presence of people who have no part in the fighting, but who are inescapably caught in the middle of it. The enemy, of course, has no such reservations. The orcs treat civilians as targets of opportunity, obstacles to be smashed aside or, depending on the individual greenskin's temperament, sources of entertainment. The tyrannids treat civilians as biomass, to be consumed at the first opportunity. Chaos forces treat civilians as potential converts, sheep to be herded into the fold of the dark gods, or as sacrificial offerings, their suffering and their death serving as fuel for the rituals that empower the cult's dark masters. In none of these approaches leave much room for civilian survival, and the defenders know this, and the knowledge adds a desperate urgency to their efforts that goes beyond military duty. They are not just defending a position, they are defending the people in the rooms behind them, People whose names they may not know, but whose faces they can picture with painful clarity, because those faces are the faces of the people who live in their hive, who share their corridors and their air and their fate. This is the grinding, relentless reality of urban warfare in the 41st millennium. It is not the clean, heroic combat of the recruitment posters or the grand strategic maneuvers of the campaign histories. It is dirty, close, personal, and agonizing. It's a form of warfare that strips away every abstraction and every ideology and every justification and leaves nothing but the raw, bleeding truth of human beings killing and dying in spaces that were built for living. The fighting in the underhive, when it comes, is a different experience again. If the hab blocks represent the destruction of domestic life, the underhive represents the descent into something older and more primal, a reversion to a state of warfare that predates civilization itself. The underhive is dark, not the dimmed lighting of a damaged hab block, but true darkness, the absolute absence of light that exists in the deepest parts of the hive, where no power has flowed for centuries. The only illumination comes from the weapons themselves, las beams and muzzle flashes and the occasional sickly glow of bioluminescent fungi. And in that intermittent light, the fighting takes on a quality that is almost supernatural. The underhive gangs are, paradoxically, among the most effective defenders in a hive city siege. They know the terrain. They have been fighting in these tunnels and corridors and collapsed domes their entire lives, and they understand the underhive's geography with an intimacy that no outsider can match. They know where the hidden passages are, the shortcuts that connect one section to another through routes that do not appear on any official map. They know where the structural weaknesses are, the places where a well-placed explosive charge can bring down a ceiling and seal a corridor. They know where the safe rooms are, the defensible positions that can be held by a small group against a much larger force. And they fight with a ferocity and a cunning that reflects their lifetime of experience in a place where violence is not an aberration, but a way of life. During the siege of Hive, the scratch companies that fought in the lower levels included gangers whose names would never appear in any official record, but whose contribution to the defense was immeasurable. They guided the guard units through the underhive's labyrinthine passages, helped them avoid the traps and hazards that awaited the unwary, and fought alongside them with the same desperate courage that the regular soldiers displayed. Some of them, like Tonacrid, went on to join the Imperial Guard after the siege, their skills as fighters and their toughness as human beings earning them a place among the Tanith first and only. Others remained in the hive, returning to the underhive that was the only home they had ever known, carrying with them the memory of a time when they had been something more than gangers and scavengers, when they had been defenders, soldiers, heroes, in all but name. The underhive also presents unique challenges for certain types of invaders. The orcs, for all their love of violence, find the underhive's cramped, dark passages frustrating. Greenskins prefer open spaces where they can charge and swing their choppers and generally behave with the enthusiastic abandon that defines their approach to combat. The narrow tunnels of the underhive deny them this pleasure, forcing them to fight in single file or in small groups that neutralize their numerical advantage. An orc in the open is terrifying. An orc in a tunnel, unable to swing its arms without hitting the walls, unable to see more than a few meters in any direction, being picked off by gangers who know every shadow and every hiding place, is something closer to confused and irritated, which is dangerous in its own right, but significantly less overwhelming than the green tide that threatens the upper levels. The Tyranids, by contrast, are nightmarishly effective in the underhive. The smaller organisms, the Genestealers and the Hormagaunts and the Termagants, are perfectly adapted to the close, dark, confined spaces of the lower hive. They move through the tunnels with a fluid, predatory grace that the human defenders cannot match, their enhanced senses allowing them to see in total darkness, and their claws allowing them to climb walls and ceilings and attack from directions that the defenders are not prepared to cover. Fighting Tyranids in the Underhive is like fighting a tide of water in a flooded mine. The organisms fill every space, flow around every obstacle, and attack from every direction simultaneously. The gangs that defend the Underhive against the Tyranids fight with the same courage and the same knowledge of the terrain, but against an enemy that does not rely on sight or sound or any of the senses that the darkness compromises. The advantage of knowing the territory is significantly diminished. Chaos forces in the Underhive are perhaps the most insidious threat of all, because the Underhive is where chaos recruits its most dangerous operatives. The mutants and the outcasts who inhabit the lowest levels of the hive are already marginalized, already resentful, already predisposed to the message of liberation and power that the dark gods offer. And a chaos cult that establishes itself in the Underhive has access to a recruitment pool of desperate, angry, capable fighters who know the terrain as well as any gang, and who are motivated by a combination of genuine religious fervor and the simple desire for revenge against a society that has rejected them. The fighting that results when such a cult reveals itself is brutal, even by the standards of the Underhive, because the combatants on both sides know each other, have lived among each other, and in some cases are members of the same families. Let us step back now from the corridors and the barricades and the darkness of the Underhive and consider the broader picture. What does a Hive city invasion mean for the Imperium? What are the consequences that extend beyond the walls of the besieged city and ripple outward through the wider galaxy? The most immediate consequence is economic. A Hive city is not just a population center. It is an engine of production, a manufactory complex on a planetary scale that churns out the weapons, the ammunition, the vehicles, the equipment, and the processed food that the Imperium requires to sustain its endless wars. When a Hive city goes offline, whether through siege or destruction or occupation, the loss of productive capacity sends shockwaves through the Imperium's supply chains that can be felt across entire sectors. Regiments that were counting on the Hive's output for their ammunition supply suddenly find themselves short. Of fleets that were relying on the Hive's fuel production suddenly find themselves unable to refuel. The tithe system, that vast network of obligations and dependencies that keeps the Imperium's military machine functioning, develops a gap that must be filled by other worlds, worlds that may already be stretched to the limit of their own productive capacity. The loss of a Hive city on Armageddon, for example, did not just affect Armageddon. It affected every world and every military formation that depended on Armageddon's output. Hive Hellsreach produced promethium fuel for half the Hive cities on the continent of Armageddon Secundus. When Hellsreach was devastated by the Orc assault, the fuel supply for the entire region was compromised, and the resulting shortages affected the Imperial war effort across the entire planet and beyond. The strategic consequences are equally significant. A Hive city is a defensive anchor, a fortified position that controls the territory around it and provides a base of operations for military forces operating in the region. When a Hive city falls, the territory it controlled becomes contested, and the enemy gains access to whatever resources and strategic advantages the Hive provided. A fallen Hive city in enemy hands is worse than no Hive city at all, because the enemy can use its infrastructure, its defensive positions, and, in the case of the Orcs, its industrial capacity to strengthen their own forces and project power into areas that were previously secure. The human cost is, of course, the most staggering of all. A Hive city houses billions of people. Even a successful defense of a Hive city under siege will typically result in civilian casualties measured in the millions from combat, from disease, from starvation, from the 1,000 other ways that a siege finds to kill people who are not directly involved in the fighting. An unsuccessful defense, one that ends with the fall of the Hive, can result in casualties measured in the billions, an extinction event on a scale that would, in any other context, be considered genocide. The Imperium's response to these losses is characteristic of its broader approach to governance. Coldly pragmatic. The dead are mourned briefly, their names added to the rolls of honor if they fought, and to the casualty lists if they did not, and then the business of reconstruction begins. New workers are imported to replace the dead, and new managers are appointed to run the rebuilding effort. New production quotas are set, and new tithe obligations are assigned. And the great machinery of imperial governance grinds forward as if the loss of 1 billion human lives is no more disruptive than a minor scheduling adjustment. This is not cruelty exactly, though it is difficult to call it anything else. It is the necessary response of a civilization that spans 1 million worlds and fights 1,000 wars simultaneously. A civilization that cannot afford to grieve because the grieving would never end. But the people who survive the siege do not have the luxury of cold pragmatism. They carry their grief with them, written into their bodies and their minds, and the way they move through the rebuilt corridors of their restored hive. They flinch at loud noises. Then they check the shadows for threats that are no longer there. They hoard food and water against a future that may never come. They tell their children stories about the siege, not the heroic stories that the administratum would prefer, but the real stories, the messy, complicated, morally ambiguous stories of what it was actually like to be there, to fight and to hide and to starve, and to watch the world you knew being dismantled around you. And the children listen, and they remember, and they pass the stories on to their own children. And the memory of the siege becomes part of the hive's identity, woven into its collective consciousness as surely as the shift schedules and the devotional hymns and the ever-present hum of the generators. The hive remembers its wounds. And that memory, as painful as it is, serves a purpose. And because it ensures that when the next invasion comes, and it will come, because the enemies of mankind are many and their hunger for human misery is endless, the people of the hive will not be entirely unprepared. They will know in their bones what it means to fight for their home, and they will stand as their parents stood and their grandparents stood and hold the line against whatever darkness comes for them next. There is a final thought that I want to leave you with, and it concerns the nature of home. A hive city is, by any rational assessment, a terrible place to live. It is overcrowded, polluted, dangerous, and oppressive. Its inhabitants work crushing hours in appalling conditions for rewards that barely sustain life, let alone make it worth living. Their air is recycled, their food is processed, their sky is a ceiling, yet their horizons are walls. By any standard that a free person might apply, a hive city is a prison, and its inhabitants are prisoners, bound not by chains, but by the simple absence of anywhere else to go. And yet they love it. Not all of them, and not all the time, and not without reservation or complaint, but in the deep, complicated, irrational way that human beings love the places where they were born and raised, and where their families live, and where their memories are stored. The hab block where you grew up is not much to look at. It is a grey box in a grey corridor in a grey level of a grey city, but it is where your mother sang you to sleep. It is where your father taught you to maintain the machinery that you would spend your life operating. It is where you carved your initials into the wall beside your cot with a stolen tool, and a tiny act of vandalism that no one ever noticed, but that gave you a sense of ownership over a space that was, technically, the property of the administratum. That hab block is home, and home is worth defending. And that is the truth that lies at the heart of every hive city siege in the history of the Imperium. When the greenskins come roaring across the ash wastes, when the cultists emerge from the shadows, when the sky darkens with the silhouettes of bioships, the people of the hive do not fight because they have been ordered to. They do not fight because they believe they can win. They do not fight because they think the emperor is watching, although they do, fiercely and devoutly. They fight because this is their home, and they will not give it up without a struggle. And the struggle is the most human thing they can do in a universe that seems designed to crush the humanity out of them. The hive endures, not because it is strong, although it is, not because it is well defended, although it can be, but because the people inside it refuse to let it die. They rebuild what is destroyed. They replace what is lost. They light new lumen strips in corridors that have gone dark, and they restart generators that have fallen silent, and they set the shift horn to sounding again, and they line up for their rations, and they go back to work, and the hum returns, and the hive lives again. This is the story of every hive city that has ever been invaded, and it is the story of the Imperium itself, a story of loss and rebuilding, of destruction and renewal, and of human beings clinging to their humanity in the face of forces that would strip it away. It is not a happy story. It is rarely even a hopeful one, but it is a story of endurance, and endurance is the quality that defines the human species in the 41st millennium. We endure, we rebuild, we go on, and the hum continues. The shift horn sounds, and 1 billion people rise. If you made it this far, I want to genuinely thank you for spending this time with me inside the hive. If the corridors felt close and the air felt stale, and the sounds of the siege seemed to echo in your ears, then I have done what I set out to do. Please hit that like button if you enjoyed this. Subscribe if you want more long-form, atmospheric dives into the lore of Warhammer 40,000. Drop a comment and tell me which Hive City siege you find most compelling, or which enemy you think would be the worst to face behind those adamantium walls. Your engagement is what keeps this channel alive, and I read every single comment. Until next time, keep the faith, keep the line, and keep listening for the hum. The Emperor protects, and so do you.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.